Somewhere out there, right now, thousands of people are convinced there's a text so dangerous, so world-altering, that entire civilizations tried to erase it from history. They call it the Emerald Tablets, and they claim it proves something almost too big to say out loud, that Atlantis, the legendary lost civilization everyone assumes was a myth, didn't actually die. It survived. It went underground, literally and figuratively, and its secrets got passed down through a chain of hidden keepers all the way to us. Sounds insane, right? Sounds like the kind of thing you'd scroll past on a late-night YouTube binge and forget by morning. Except millions of people haven't forgotten it. For over a century, this story has refused to die. Spiritual seekers, treasure hunters, historians, even a few scientists have all gotten pulled into the same question. What if the Emerald Tablets aren't just some ancient myth? What if they're a message? A warning smuggled across thousands of years, waiting for someone to finally listen. Here's where it gets messy though, and honestly, that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. When people say Emerald Tablets, they're usually talking about two completely different things without even realizing it. There's the ancient tradition, a short cryptic text called the Tabula Smaragdina, the Emerald Tablet, singular, that shows up in medieval alchemy manuscripts and gets attributed to a mysterious figure named Hermes Trismegistus. Scholars have actually studied this one. It has a real, if murky, paper trail. Then there's the other version, the one that gets all the internet attention. The Emerald Tablets of Thoth, plural, a sprawling 20th century text claiming to be translated from ancient tablets found in a hidden chamber beneath the Great Pyramid. This version is the one packed with Atlantis, with cataclysms, with secret knowledge passed down by immortal keepers. Two names, two completely different stories, and almost everyone online blends them together like they're the same thing. That's exactly what we're going to untangle today. We're going to walk through where this idea actually comes from, what's genuinely ancient, what's modern invention dressed up in old language, and why the Atlantis connection keeps refusing to go away no matter how many times historians try to shut the door on it. We're not here to tell you it's all fake or all real. We're here to actually look at the evidence, the provenance, the historical record, and yeah, the speculation too, because speculation is part of why this story has lasted this long. By the end, you'll understand why a text nobody can definitively date, written about a civilization nobody can definitively prove existed, has managed to survive in human imagination for thousands of years. Some ideas just refuse to be forgotten. Maybe that's the real mystery here. Now, if you're one of those people using this as background noise while you fall asleep, hey, that's exactly why I make these. So do me a favour. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love checking these later and seeing it's like Sydney at sunrise, Chicago right before bed, London on a lunch break, all at the exact same moment, all listening to the same weird story about tablets and lost cities. It's honestly one of my favourite parts of doing this. And if you want to actually support the channel in a way that really helps, the best thing you can do is find this on Spotify, hit follow, and if you've got 30 seconds, leave a 5-star review. There's a link in the description. It genuinely makes a difference in whether more people find these stories, and it costs you nothing but a tap. Alright, let's get into it. Let's start with what people think the Emerald Tablets actually are, and why the word forbidden keeps attaching itself to them. So, let's actually sit with this word for a second. Forbidden. Because that word is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this whole story, and it's worth asking why. Nobody ever describes a tax record as forbidden. Nobody calls a shopping list from 3,000 years ago dangerous. But the moment you slap the word forbidden onto a text, something shifts in your brain. Suddenly you're not looking at an old document anymore. You're looking at a secret, something somebody didn't want you to see. And that feeling, that itch of being let in on something you shouldn't technically know, is one of the oldest storytelling tricks in human history. It works on us because we're wired for it. We want to believe there's a version of the past that's been hidden from us, a truth that got buried on purpose rather than just lost through the ordinary chaos of time. The Emerald Tablets tap directly into that wiring, and honestly, that's half of why they're still floating around the internet 100 years after some of this material was even written. Here's the basic shape of the popular story, the version you'll find repeated across countless videos, forum posts, and dog-eared paperbacks from the metaphysical section of a used bookstore. Long before Egypt, long before Sumer, long before any civilization historians officially recognize, there was Atlantis. A highly advanced society, spiritually enlightened, technologically sophisticated, maybe even beyond what we have today. Then disaster struck. A flood, a cataclysm, some kind of global reset that wiped out almost everything. But a handful of survivors escaped. And they didn't just escape with their lives. They escaped with knowledge, sacred knowledge, dangerous knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could rebuild civilization or destroy it again if it fell into the wrong hands. So they encoded it, they wrote it down, not in ordinary language but in symbols, in layered meanings, in a text designed to only make sense to the right kind of reader. And they hid it. Sometimes literally in a chamber beneath a pyramid, sometimes figuratively passed down through secret orders, whispered from teacher to student for thousands of years. Eventually, so the story goes, this knowledge surfaced again as the Emerald Tablets. Proof, if you believe it, that Atlantis didn't vanish into myth. It went underground, and it's still shaping the world from the shadows. Now, is that a real historical claim backed by verifiable evidence? We'll get into that, and I promise you the answer is more complicated and more interesting than a simple yes or no, but right now, just notice the structure of that story, because the structure is the point. You've got a hidden lineage, a chain of keepers stretching back to some golden age. You've got suppressed knowledge, information too powerful or too true to be allowed into common hands. And you've got initiates versus outsiders, a divide between the people who know and the people who don't. That three-part structure shows up everywhere in human storytelling, from ancient mystery religions to modern conspiracy theories to half the plots in Hollywood movies. It's compelling because it flatters the reader. If you're the one learning the secret, you're not an outsider anymore. You've crossed over. You're one of the people who know. And once a story convinces you that you're standing on the inside of a velvet rope, it's very, very hard to walk away from it. But here's where things get genuinely tangled. And this is the part almost nobody online bothers to slow down and explain properly. The phrase Emerald Tablets doesn't point to one thing. It points to at least two very different traditions that happen to share a name. And over the last century they've been mashed together so thoroughly that most people have no idea they're even separate. On one side, you've got the Emerald Tablet, singular, sometimes called by its Latin name, the Tabula Smaragdina. This is a genuinely old text, at least old in the sense that it shows up in real historical manuscripts, copied and recopied by medieval alchemists across Europe and the Islamic world. It's short, it's cryptic, it's the source of that famous phrase you've probably heard even if you didn't know where it came from. As above, so below. It's attributed to a legendary figure named Hermes Trismegistus, and it became a foundational text for an entire philosophical and mystical tradition called Hermeticism. This version has an actual paper trail. Historians can trace even if the earliest origins are genuinely murky, and even if nobody can prove Hermes Trismegistus was a real person at all. We'll dig into exactly what scholars agree on here in a bit, because there's more solid ground to stand on than you might expect. On the other side, you've got the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, plural, and this is where Atlantis fully enters the picture. This version is a 20th century creation, allegedly translated from a set of ancient tablets, discovered in a secret chamber beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza by a man claiming to have lived in ancient Egypt in a past life. This text is long, it's narrative. It reads more like a mystical adventure story than an alchemical riddle, and it's absolutely stuffed with material about Atlantis, about the cataclysm that destroyed it, about immortal beings who survived and carried civilization forward in secret. This is the version that shows up in almost every viral post about forbidden ancient wisdom. This is the one people usually mean when they say emerald tablets, even though it has essentially nothing to do, historically speaking, with the medieval alchemical text that shares its name. So why do these two completely different things keep getting blended into one? Partly it's just laziness, the internet flattening nuance, because nuance doesn't perform well in a 15-second clip. But partly it's something more interesting. The 20th century version was deliberately written to sound like it belonged to the same lineage as the older Hermetic tradition. It borrowed the name Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing and wisdom, who the Greeks had already linked to Hermes centuries earlier. It borrowed the aesthetic of ancient wisdom literature, the numbered tablets, the aphoristic tone, the sense of encoded secrets waiting to be decoded by the worthy. In other words, the newer text was built to feel like a continuation of something ancient and legitimate, and it worked so well that most people can no longer tell where the real historical thread ends and the modern invention begins. That's not necessarily an accusation of bad faith. Plenty of spiritual and philosophical traditions build new material on top of old names. That's actually a pretty normal thing that's happened throughout religious history. But it does mean we have to be honest about which parts of this story we can actually trace through documents and manuscripts, and which parts are essentially modern fiction dressed in ancient clothing. And that brings us back to why the whole thing feels forbidden in the first place. It's not because some shadowy organization is actually trying to suppress this text, at least not that anyone's ever been able to demonstrate. It's forbidden in the narrative sense, the storytelling sense. It's forbidden because the story needs it to be forbidden. A hidden lineage only feels powerful if someone tried to erase it. Suppressed knowledge only feels valuable if there was a suppressor. The gatekeeping between initiates and outsiders only means something if crossing that line feels like it costs you something. Every great mystery needs stakes, and forbidden is one of the cheapest, most effective ways to manufacture stakes without needing a single shred of evidence. None of this means the emerald tablets are worthless or that everyone who's fascinated by them is being fooled. Stories can be historically shaky and still meaningful, still worth taking seriously as cultural artifacts, still worth digging into with real curiosity. But if we're going to actually understand where this idea comes from, why it grabbed hold of the modern imagination, and whether there's any genuine thread connecting it back to a real lost civilization, we need to stop treating the Hermetic Emerald Tablet and the Emerald Tablets of Thoth as the same object. They're not. They come from different centuries, different authors, different worlds entirely. And once you pull them apart, the real story, the one about how ancient wisdom gets built, borrowed, and reinvented across thousands of years, turns out to be just as strange as the legend itself. So let's start with the one that actually has a paper trail, the historical Emerald Tablet, singular. If you strip away all the YouTube thumbnails and the CGI pyramids and the Atlantean laser beams, what you're left with is a very short, very dense, very weird little text. In the Hermetic tradition, it's called the Tabula Smaragdina, the Emerald Tablet. It's usually framed as a kind of cosmic memo from Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary sage who's supposed to be part Greek god, part Egyptian deity, part archetypal wizard. But when scholars talk about it, they're not imagining a glowing green stone hidden under a temple. They're talking about a few dozen lines of prose that show up copied in ink on parchment, sitting in manuscripts in libraries from Cairo to Paris. And this is the first important split between the myth and the history. In the popular story, the Emerald Tablet is literally a slab of emerald engraved in some forgotten antediluvian age. In the historical record, it's text, words, a small piece of a much larger current of Hermetic and alchemical writing that circulated through the medieval Islamic world and then into Latin Europe. Now, pinning down how old it really is where things get murky, and this is one of those places where careful phrasing actually matters. We do not have an original emerald tablet in Greek from the time of Plato. We don't have a neat chain going back to pharaonic Egypt. What we do have are Arabic sources from roughly the 8th to 10th centuries where something recognizably like the Emerald Tablet appears embedded inside larger alchemical treatises. In some of those works, the tablet is presented as an ancient saying, a revelation, a secret text that an alchemist is transmitting. It's already legendary inside the manuscript. That tells you two things at once. By the time it shows up in Arabic, people thought it was much older, and at the same time, the actual documentary trail starts there. Before that, we're in the realm of inference and speculation, not hard evidence. From the Arabic, the text moves into Latin. By the 12th century, we start seeing Latin translations of the Emerald Tablet circulating among European alchemists. It gets quoted, glossed, commented on. Different versions tweak the wording, expand a phrase, compress a line, but the skeleton is the same, a compact aphoristic statement about how reality works and how transformation happens. And from there, it just lodges itself in the heart of Western esoteric thought. By the Renaissance, if you were an ambitious alchemist, you had an opinion about what the Emerald Tablet really meant. So what does it actually say? The exact wording varies by manuscript, but the core themes are surprisingly consistent. At the centre of the whole thing is that famous idea usually shortened to as above, so below. The tablet phrases it more elaborately. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of one thing. That sentence has fueled entire libraries of commentary. At minimum, it's saying there's a correspondence between different levels of reality. The macrocosm and the microcosm mirror each other. The structure of the cosmos is reflected in the structure of the human being, or the laboratory, or the soul. If you understand one level deeply enough, you can infer truths about the other. But the tablet doesn't stop at correspondence. It's obsessed with transformation. It talks about separating the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity. It describes as something often interpreted as the philosopher's stone, or the universal principle that rises from earth to heaven, and again descends to earth and receives the power of the superiors and the inferiors. This is alchemical language, but it's also metaphysical language. Matter and spirit aren't two sealed compartments. They're a cycle, a circulation. In the most stripped-down reading, it's a recipe for doing alchemy in the lab. Take a substance, purify it, transform it through fire, and dissolution and recombination until you reveal its hidden perfection. In a more philosophical reading, it's a map of inner work. Take yourself, your psyche, your habits, separate out what's coarse from what's refined, raise it up in contemplation or prayer, then bring that insight down into embodied life. In both cases, the underlying claim is the same. The universe is one thing. There is a unity of matter and spirit, and transformation in one domain echoes transformation in the other. That unity theme is crucial. The tablet talks about the one thing from which all things are born, the one mind, the one. Medieval readers steeped in Neoplatonism saw here a poetic description of emanation, the many unfolding from the one and then returning. Later occultists heard prefigured quantum mysticism or monistic idealism. You don't have to agree with any particular interpretation to see why the text wouldn't die. In 12-ish lines, it gives you a cosmic origin story, a theory of knowledge, and a manual for changing reality. Notice what's missing, though. No Atlantis. No named continents sinking beneath the waves. No resets. No explicit cataclysms. If you squint hard enough, you can read cycles of destruction and renewal into the idea of death and rebirth in matter, or into the ascent and descent of the thing between heaven and earth. But those are symbolic cycles, not historical events. Nothing in the surviving Arabic or Latin emerald tablet manuscript says, "By the way, this was carved by Atlantean priest kings after the flood." And that's where the forbidden aura starts to look a little different. The historical emerald tablet isn't dangerous because it hides a literal map to a lost continent. It's dangerous, if you want to use that word, because it suggests that the entire cosmos is intelligible and transformable, that the same patterns show up in stars and cells and human choices, that mind and matter interpenetrate. Those are ideas philosophers, theologians and mystics have wrestled with for centuries, and the tablet became a convenient, authoritative container for all that wrestling. In other words, it doesn't need Atlantis to matter. Its influence runs through medieval alchemy, Renaissance magic, Rosicrucian manifestos, Masonic symbolism, 19th century occult revivals, and modern New Age thought. Every time someone talks about the universe as a hologram or as within, so without, they're echoing the same basic hermetic logic that commentators saw in this little text. You can study the Emerald Tablet purely as a historical artifact and still end up knee-deep in questions about consciousness, physics, and what it means to change. So when people fuse it with Atlantean survival myths, they're grafting one powerful narrative engine onto another. But the engine that actually shows up in the manuscripts is Hermetic, not Atlantean. To understand how that Hermetic authority gets built, why sticking Hermes Trismegistus' name on something made it sound ancient and unchallengeable, we have to follow the figure of Hermes himself back through Greek, Egyptian, and late antique history. That's where the story of ancient wisdom really starts to take shape. Hermes Trismegistus is where everything gets braided together. If the Emerald Tablet is the spark, Hermes is the power plant people plug into to make that spark look like it's coming from the dawn of time. The name itself is already a mashup. Hermes is the Greek god, messenger of the Olympians, patron of travellers, tricksters, merchants, and later of clever magic and occult knowledge. Thrice great, Trismegistus is a title that probably echoes Egyptian praise formulas for Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, calculation, and sacred wisdom. Somewhere in the cultural blender of Hellenistic Egypt, people started saying, Hermes is basically the Greek face of Thoth, and the two deities fused. Out of that fusion you get not just a god, but a supposed historical sage, a quasi-mythic philosopher-priest who, according to later stories, lived in remote antiquity, maybe before the flood, maybe before Egypt even had dynasties. He's credited with inventing writing, astronomy, astrology, geometry, theology, and pretty much any other discipline you want to have deep roots. If there was a mystery, Hermes knew it. If there was a book, Hermes wrote it. Or at least that's how the marketing worked. And marketing is actually the right word here, because this is where pseudepigrapha come in. In antiquity and late antiquity, slapping a famous name on a text wasn't necessarily seen as simple forgery the way we'd see it now. It was part literary device, part statement of allegiance, part way of situating your ideas inside an existing lineage. You want to write a powerful revelation text? Put it in the mouth of Enoch, or Moses, or an apostle, or in this case, Hermes Trismegistus. You're not necessarily trying to trick your readers so much as saying, this is the kind of wisdom that belongs with that figure. Scholars call these works pseudepigrapha, writings falsely attributed to a revered author. But in their own time, they functioned as spiritual fan fiction with theological authority. A student steeped in a tradition writes the lost sermon or the hidden dialogue of the master. Later readers might believe it literally, others might treat it as inspired imagination. Either way, the name on the cover acts like a time machine. It drops your text into the very distant past and lets it speak from there. Hermetic literature shows this pattern clearly. The core Greek Hermetic writings we have, things like the Corpus Hermeticum, are usually dated somewhere between the late 1st and 3rd centuries CE. That's Roman-era Egypt. By that point, Alexander the Great has come and gone. The Ptolemies have turned Alexandria into a cosmopolitan mega-city. Egypt is layered, pharaonic temples are still standing, Greek philosophy is in vogue, Jewish communities are interpreting their scriptures through Plato, and early Christians are arguing about who Christ really is. In that melting pot, people are hungry for synthesis. They want a vision of the cosmos that isn't just one ethnicity's story or one city's cult, but something universal. Hermetic texts deliver exactly that. They talk about the One, the mind of the universe, the emanation of all things, the ascent of the soul through the spheres. They sound like a cross between Plato, Egyptian temple theology, and mystery religion initiation scripts. But instead of being written as "here's a treatise by a philosopher in Alexandria," year 180, they're written as dialogues between Hermes Trismegistus and his disciples, or between Hermes and the divine nous, or mind. Hermes is already framed as an impossibly ancient sage, older than Moses, older than Homer, maybe a survivor of earlier world ages. So when he speaks in these texts, he's not announcing a new philosophy. He's remembering something primordial. The historical setting, though, is absolutely late antique. You can see it in the language, the concepts, the preoccupation with salvation and rebirth. People are wrestling with a world empire, social upheaval, religious competition, and a sense that the cosmos is vast, ordered, and maybe fading. Ritual, philosophy, and visionary experience all blur together. Hermeticism lives right there, alongside Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, early Christian mysticism, and theurgy. In that environment, the figure of Hermes becomes a perfect authority engine. If you want your ideas to sound like ancient Egyptian temple secrets, you present them as the true inner meaning of Egyptian religion revealed by Hermes. If you want them to sound philosophically respectable to a Greek-educated audience, you put them in dialogue form, full of Platonic themes, and attribute them to Hermes, the god of clever speech. If you want them to outrank rival traditions, you date Hermes to before the flood, or before the Greeks, or as a source Moses himself supposedly read. Later chronographers will literally build timelines where Hermes is slotted as a pre-biblical prophet. That's how ancient authority gets built. You start in a very specific time and place, Alexandria, 2nd or 3rd century, and then you narrate backwards. You say what we're doing now is actually the resurfacing of a much older revelation. You wrap your current synthesis in the robes of an archetypal sage, whose origins are safely beyond verification. No one can dig up census records on Hermes Trismegistus. That vagueness is a feature, not a bug. Fast forward a few centuries, and Christian and Muslim thinkers encounter Hermetic writings already loaded with this aura. Some church fathers condemn Hermes as a pagan magician, others cherry-pick him as a pagan witness to monotheism. Islamic scholars weave Hermes into their own prophetic genealogies, sometimes equating him with Idris, sometimes casting him as a pre-flood prophet who inscribed wisdom on pillars before the waters rose. Each reuse pushes Hermes further back in time, higher up the prophetic hierarchy. By the Renaissance, when European humanists rediscover the Corpus Hermeticum, They initially believe these are literally older than Plato and Moses. Marsilio Ficino, Cosimo de' Medici's house philosopher, translates them as if he's finally hearing the voice of humanity's first theologian. For decades, educated Europeans treat Hermetic texts as the surviving fragments of a primordial world religion. Only later philology will show, no, these are late antique compositions with Egyptian flavouring. But the damage is done, in a sense. Hermes' brand as a pre-flood, proto-everything sage is locked in. When alchemists and occultists quote the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, they're plugging into that whole constructed lineage. The very attribution says, this isn't just medieval chemistry. This is Atlantidean level, pyramid era, pre-Diluvian gnosis, even if the actual text comes from an 8th century Arabic manuscript. That's also why later readers feel comfortable retrofitting Atlantean and reset stories onto Hermetic material. If Hermes is imagined as someone who lived before or through a cataclysm, then anything attributed to him can be cast as a survival document. The authority doesn't come from carbon dating. It comes from the narrative scaffolding built over centuries, Greek god plus Egyptian god, turned into primordial prophet, speaking out of a mythic deep past. Understanding that scaffolding doesn't make the ideas in Hermeticism trivial. It actually makes them more interesting, because now we can see them as a brilliant late antique attempt to weave together Egyptian ritual, Greek philosophy, and personal spiritual experience into one grand story about the universe. But it does change how we read claims of "this is pre-flood wisdom." Very often what we're looking at is late antique or medieval wisdom wearing a very old mask. And that mask is about to get another makeover when Atlantis walks on stage. Because the moment you tie Hermes and his emerald tablet to Plato's sunken island, you're not just claiming ancient authority. You're claiming that a lost civilization's survivors encoded their knowledge in Hermetic texts. To see how that leap happens, we have to go back to Plato and look at what Atlantis was actually supposed to be. To get Atlantis right, we have to do something most modern retellings quietly skip. We have to go back to the only ancient source that actually gives us a detailed story, Plato. Not a lost Sanskrit scroll, not a burned library of Alexandria catalogue, not an inscription on some vanished pillar. Just Plato in 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the unfinished Critias. And even there he doesn't say, "Here is my travel report from a sunken continent." He wraps Atlantis inside a chain of storytellers, and that framing is the first clue to what he's really doing. The story goes like this. In the Timaeus, the main speaker is a man named Critias. He says he heard about Atlantis when he was a boy, from his grandfather, who heard it from his own father, who supposedly heard it from Solon, the famous Athenian lawgiver. Solon, in turn, allegedly heard it from Egyptian priests at Sais, who were guardians of very old temple records. So the knowledge pipeline, as Plato presents it, is Egyptian priests, Solon, Critias's family, Plato's dialogue. Already you can feel the Hermetic pattern echoing, Egypt as archive of primordial wisdom transmitted across centuries, surfacing in a philosophical text. But Plato isn't pretending he dug up tablets from the sea floor. He's telling a story about a story, with multiple generations of oral transmission and foreign priests as custodians of deep time. Inside that frame, Atlantis is not a vague mystical realm. It's described with almost bureaucratic precision. According to Critias, Atlantis was a great island power larger than Libya and Asia together, situated beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually read as the Strait of Gibraltar. It had a central city with concentric rings of land and water, canals, bridges, and an elaborate harbour system. The royal line traced back to Poseidon, the sea god. 10 kings ruled 10 regions under a common law code, meeting periodically, sacrificing bulls, swearing oaths over a pillar inscribed with their laws. This wasn't just a random spiritual metaphor in the text. Atlantis is a thalassocracy, a maritime empire, with a professional military, advanced agriculture, and enough political organization to launch coordinated campaigns. Critias says they controlled not only their own island, but many other islands and parts of the opposite continent, and even extended deep into the Mediterranean. Then comes the conflict. At some point, the Atlanteans, originally noble and God-favoured, become corrupted. Their divine portion gets diluted by too much mortal inheritance. They grow greedy, imperial, and unjust. They begin to conquer aggressively, pushing against the peoples of the Mediterranean, including a very ancient, idealized Athens. Plato's Athenians in this story stand for everything Atlantis has lost: moderation, courage, just law, harmonious social order. The two powers collide, instead of Atlantis wiping out primitive barbarians with ray guns and crystal tech. As modern retellings might have it, Plato has the reverse. The ancient Athenians defeat the might of Atlantis. They repel the invasion, free other peoples, and show their moral superiority, and then, only then, does the cataclysm hit. Plato gives the line that will echo through every Atlantis theory that comes after, that in a single day and night of misfortune, violent earthquakes and floods came. The Athenian army was swallowed by the earth, and the island of Atlantis likewise disappeared into the depths of the sea, making the ocean there difficult to navigate because of shoals of mud. Single day and night. Sudden. Total. No slow decline. No centuries-long war. One catastrophic punctuation mark at the end of a moral parable. And it is a moral parable. Inside Plato's own philosophical architecture, Atlantis isn't just world-building for fun. It serves at least three clear functions. First, it's a mirror for his ideal state. The ancient Athens he describes in these dialogues overlaps suspiciously well with the ideal polis he lays out earlier in the Republic. Philosopher kings, strict social order, communal values. Atlantis is what happens when a god-descended ruling class forgets the virtues that justified their rule in the first place. Second, it's a case study in cosmic justice. In Plato's worldview, the cosmos is ordered, and hubris doesn't just annoy the gods, it destabilizes reality. Civilizations that abandon justice invite a kind of metaphysical correction. Atlantis is the cautionary tale. Even the most powerful empire can vanish overnight if it loses its moral compass. Third, it's setting up a stage for talking about cycles, disasters, and the fragility of human memory. In the Timaeus, the Egyptian priest tells Solon that humanity has been wiped out many times by fire and water, and that Greeks are like children because their records don't go back far enough to remember the previous cycles. Atlantis is one example plugged into that larger pattern. This is where modern reset narratives latch on. Plato is explicitly talking about recurring catastrophes and lost histories. But his point isn't, there was a super-tech hyper-civilization with flying machines. His point is, don't be arrogant. Civilizations rise and fall, and even your best institutions sit on geologically unstable ground. So how do scholars read all this? There's debate, but the mainstream view leans heavily toward Atlantis being primarily a literary philosophical construction. Not necessarily because Plato never uses history, but because of how tightly the Atlantis narrative is welded to his existing philosophical agenda. It reads like an origin myth for his political theory, not like a neutral chronicle. The timescale is suspect. He dates Atlantis to about 9,000 years before Solon, which would put the Great War around 9,600 BCE, long before anything like classical city-states existed, as far as archaeology can tell. The geography is vague. The source chain is uncheckable. And crucially, no independent ancient source corroborates Plato's detailed story. Later writers who mention Atlantis are clearly riffing on him, not citing their own older records. That doesn't mean there couldn't have been real floods, real islands, real Bronze Age powers that fed into the myth. It means the figure called Atlantis in our cultural imagination comes from Plato's crafted narrative first, everything else second. But the crafting is exactly what makes it so potent. Plato gives later generations a perfectly shaped myth engine, a powerful island civilization at the edge of the known world, morally compromised, destroyed in a single catastrophic day and night, remembered only through a thin thread of priestly records and philosophical storytelling. That is story fuel. It gives later thinkers, mystics, and fringe historians a ready-made template. What if Plato's cautionary tale was actually a distorted memory of a real lost civilization? Once you pose that question, you can start plugging almost anything into the Atlantis slot. Megaliths, out-of-place artifacts, flood myths, even Hermetic sages like Hermes Trismegistus. And that's exactly what happens. Over the next 2,000 years, Atlantis will be slowly pried loose from Plato's original moral framing and refitted as a proto-Egypt, a prehistoric superculture, or the mother civilization behind every mystery tradition on Earth. To see how we go from a philosophical parable about hubris to Atlantean laser pyramids and pre-reset tech, we have to track that evolution. How people read Plato, misread him, and then build entire lost civilization traditions on top of a story that started life as a warning. Once Plato launches Atlantis into the cultural bloodstream, it doesn't immediately become the centerpiece of every mystery tradition. For a long time, it's more like an interesting footnote. In late antiquity and the medieval period, most people who even knew about Atlantis encountered it secondhand. They weren't reading pristine Greek manuscripts in a quiet library. They were getting Plato through filters, Latin summaries, commentaries, Christian compilers who were choosy about what they preserved. For Christian thinkers, Atlantis was awkward. On the one hand, it's a big flood and punishment story which fits nicely with biblical themes. On the other hand, it's pagan. It predates Noah by thousands of years, and it doesn't line up neatly with Scripture. So instead of treating it like an alternate sacred history, they mostly file it under useful allegory or pagan curiosity. Some medieval writers see Atlantis as a symbolic lesson on pride, just as Plato intended. Others treat it like they treat monsters at the edge of old maps. Maybe there's some weird land far out past the known sea. Maybe it's just a story. Either way, it sits comfortably in the realm of the marvelous. You get occasional geographical speculation. Was Plato talking about the Canary Islands? A distorted memory of some Western land mass, but nothing like a full-blown lost global civilization. Even in the Renaissance, when Europeans rediscover Plato and go wild for Hermetic texts, Atlantis isn't yet the main character. Thinkers like Marsilio Ficino are obsessed with ancient wisdom, Egypt and Prisca Theologia, the primeval theology behind all religions. They talk about Orpheus, Hermes, Zoroaster, Moses. Atlantis shows up here and there as an exotic example, a maybe historical island in the far ocean. But it's still basically Plato's Atlantis, a powerful state, morally corrupted, swept away. The big pivot doesn't happen until Europe's horizons literally expand. Once the Americas are discovered, suddenly there is, in fact, a huge landmass beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Reports come back of pyramids in Mexico, massive earthworks, complex calendars, serpent gods, flood myths, solar cults. For European imaginations primed on Plato, this is gasoline on a slow smoulder. Now Atlantis starts to be read through a new lens. Maybe people suggest Plato's story was garbled geography. Maybe Atlantis was actually part of the New World. Maybe indigenous Americans are descended from Atlanteans, or preserved their wisdom in distorted form. You start seeing speculative maps, half-serious proposals that connect Aztec temples, Egyptian obelisks, and Plato's vanished island into one loose network of correspondences. Still, until the 19th century, this stays mostly in the realm of wild but marginal speculation. The mainstream is busy with empire, industry, and biblical archaeology. Atlantis is fun to argue about, but not yet a central explanatory tool. That changes with Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, this American congressman and self-taught scholar publishes Atlantis, the antediluvian world, and the game board flips. Donnelly doesn't treat Atlantis as a moral fable. He treats it as a missing chapter of literal history, and more than that, as the origin story for nearly everything impressive in the ancient world. For Donnelly, Atlantis is not just a powerful island empire. It is the mother country of civilization. He argues that after a great cataclysm, essentially a global flood, survivors from Atlantis spread out and seeded culture across the planet. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, the megalith builders of Europe, all in his view are branches off the same Atlantean trunk. This is what scholars call a diffusionist narrative. Instead of complex societies arising independently in different regions, Donnelly says, no, there was one original centre of high culture, and it diffused outward as refugees and colonists carried its knowledge to less advanced peoples. Why does this catch on? Because it's an incredibly efficient story engine. You're a Victorian reader. Archaeologists are digging up ziggurats in Iraq, hieroglyphs in Egypt, strange idols on Pacific islands, massive mounds in the American Midwest. Everywhere you look, there are ruins and symbols you don't fully understand. Comparative mythologists are publishing thick books showing that cultures across the world all talk about floods, world ages, serpent deities, sun gods. You can take two broad approaches. One, you say humans everywhere are capable of symbolic thought, monumental architecture, and religious imagination. Given similar ecological pressures, they invent similar solutions and similar stories. Parallel invention, convergent evolution. Or two, you say, there must be a single source. Atlantis, in Donnelly's hands, becomes that single source. It's the USB drive that explains why pyramids show up in both Egypt and Mesoamerica. It's the shared origin that makes flood myths feel like corrupted memories of one real, specific deluge. It's the invisible missionary force behind agriculture, stonework, calendars, even language families. From here on, Atlantis stops being just that one place Plato used to make a philosophical point and becomes a kind of cultural wildcard. Anytime you meet a mystery, how did they move those stones? Why do these symbols look alike? Who taught these people astronomy? You can play the Atlantis card. This is also where the survivors spreading knowledge plotline gets locked in. Donnelly doesn't invent the idea from nothing. Plato already has an echo of it in the Egyptian priests preserving records after floods, and in the notion of an older cycle, remembered only imperfectly by later Greeks. Biblical tradition has Noah's descendants repopulating the earth after the flood. Many indigenous myths feature culture heroes who arrive after disaster to reteach humans how to plant crops, build houses, and perform rituals. Donnelly just stitches these threads together and gives them a centralized cast, Atlantean refugees. Once that framing exists, later writers barely have to work. You want to explain how supposedly primitive peoples built precise astronomical alignments. Atlantean sages taught them. Curious about why serpent symbols are everywhere. Traces of an Atlantean cult, confused by similarities in mythic motifs. They're all faint echoes of a single lost doctrine carried by survivors to every continent. The plot has enormous psychological appeal. It flatters us by suggesting there was once a unified advanced knowledge system, and that scattered clues to it still exist if we're clever enough to decode them. It turns broken statues and half-translated myths into pieces of a treasure map, and it fits neatly with a 19th century worldview that often underestimated the capacities of non-European cultures. If you can't imagine that Maya astronomers or Egyptian architects figured things out themselves, an Atlantean tutor becomes a comforting intermediary. By the early 20th century, Atlantis is no longer just a ruined island. It's a container. Into it, people pour everything that feels ancient, impressive, and unexplained. Pyramids, megaliths, global myths, esoteric symbols. The more this container fills up, the easier it becomes to slide it into other frameworks. Theosophy, occultism, later New Age thought, where Atlantis isn't just historical, it's spiritual. And that's where the reset language really starts to crystallize. Cycles, cataclysms, survivors, carrying a spark of higher wisdom through the darkness. Exactly the atmosphere in which something like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth will later claim that Atlantis didn't die at all. It graduated, went underground, and kept teaching. When people online talk about a reset, they're not just saying bad stuff happened in the past. The word has a very specific shape. A reset in this mythology has 3 ingredients. First, a catastrophic event, flood, fire, impact, crustal shift, solar flare, pick your flavour. Second, a massive loss of knowledge, libraries gone, cities erased, technologies forgotten, timelines scrambled. Third, a reboot, a handful of survivors or a hidden priesthood, slowly rebuilding civilization, but starting from a much lower baseline than before. It's not just destruction, it's a factory reset of human culture. In this model, history doesn't move in a straight line from stone tools to iPhones. It moves in loops. Civilizations climb to some dazzling height, get knocked off the shelf, shatter, and then centuries or millennia later, somebody else starts stacking the pieces again. Every time we think we're at the peak, we're actually just mid-climb in the latest cycle. Once that idea takes hold, you start seeing resets everywhere. People point to the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, when sea levels rose by more than 100 meters and coastlines redrew themselves. They point to volcanic winters, impact craters, abrupt climate shifts recorded in ice cores. But even more than geology, they point to stories. Because cultures all over the world really do tell stories about the world ending or nearly ending. Mesopotamia gives us Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, warned by a god to build a boat and survive a flood that drowns humanity. The Hebrew Bible has Noah. In India, one version of the story has Manu guided by a fish avatar of Vishnu who helps him survive a deluge and re-establish Dharma. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha float in a chest until the waters recede and then repopulate the land. Go to Mesoamerica, and you find the Maya talking about previous creations and destructions of the world, including floods. In Andean tradition, the god Viracocha wipes out a race of giants with a great water and starts again. Polynesian myths remember islands sinking and rising. Many Aboriginal Australian songlines describe ancient shorelines far inland, as if remembering a time before the seas invaded. If you collect these stories in a big comparative volume, like Victorian scholars love to do, it looks uncanny. Floods everywhere. Serpents and dragons associated with water and chaos. Gods choosing 1 or 2 humans, telling them how to survive and then repopulate or reteach the world. It's easy to slide from these are widespread mythic motifs to these are garbled eyewitness reports of one single global cataclysm. That's the move the reset narrative makes, and it's the move Atlantis theories piggyback on. But there's a quieter, less dramatic possibility that scholars tend to favour. Humans everywhere live next to rivers that flood. They build on coasts where storms and tsunamis can erase villages overnight. They watch glaciers advance and retreat. Lakes appear and vanish. Volcanoes bury fields under ash. If you're a small society and your valley floods so badly that half your population dies, it feels like the end of the world. Mythologize that over a few generations, and your My Village Drowned story becomes the world was covered in water. Different cultures facing similar environmental risks will often tell similar catastrophe stories, not because they all remember the same event, but because floods and fires and famines are universal human experiences. Still, the pattern is suggestive, and the human brain is pattern-hungry. Once you already believe in resets, every flood myth becomes Exhibit A. This is where ideas of cyclical time pour gasoline on the fire. In the modern West, we're used to history as a timeline with an arrow, past, present, future. But many of the traditions that later get woven into Atlantis lore see time as layered or repeating. In ancient India, the concept of yugas describes vast ages that decline from a golden era of truth and virtue down into darker, more corrupt periods. At the end of a full cycle, the world is renewed, sometimes with explicit language of floods and fire, and a new golden age begins. Greek thinkers talk about ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. The oldest humans live in harmony with the gods. Each subsequent age is more violent, more unjust, further from cosmic order. Hesiod doesn't give us a neat reset button, but he does give us a clear sense that history is not one long upward slope. In Mesoamerican cosmologies, like the Aztec Five Suns doctrine, the world has already been created and destroyed multiple times, by jaguars, by wind, by fire, by floods. We live in the age of the fifth sun, always with the knowledge that previous worlds have ended, and this one can too. Even in more linear traditions, you get echoes of cycles and wipes. The biblical flood, apocalyptic visions in Zoroastrianism and Christianity, where the world is melted, purged, renewed. Plato himself talks about periodic destructions of humanity by fire and water, after which only a remnant survives to rebuild. Put all that together, and you get a worldview in which resets aren't just possible, they're expected. So when a modern text like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth says, in effect, there was a great cataclysm, but the wise ones of Atlantis foresaw it, went underground and preserved the higher knowledge, it's not inventing a new plot. It's plugging into an ancient template. We're already primed for it. We've heard stories all our lives in which everything is wiped clean except one boat, one mountain refuge, one hidden city, one group of initiates. Our imaginations have been trained to expect that when the masses are swept away, someone, somewhere, is carrying a spark through the darkness. Catastrophic storytelling does two things at once. On the surface, it terrifies. It reminds us that everything solid can vanish. Cities sink, empires crumble, libraries burn, seas rise. But underneath it reassures. It tells us that even when the slate is almost wiped clean, it's never completely empty. A righteous family preserves the covenant. A culture hero keeps the rituals. A secret order guards the books. The world might reset, but the story of wisdom continues in a narrow, protected channel. If you already live inside that mental world, a claim like Atlantis survived the reset lands softly. Of course it did. Of course there were survivors. Of course they kept the real teachings hidden from the chaos above. The only new twist the Emerald Tablets add is to say, those survivors weren't just generic righteous humans or favoured prophets. They were Atlantean adepts, masters of a science spirituality, so advanced we'd read it as magic. They went inside the earth or other dimensions, waited out the storm, and then, when the time was right, stepped back into history under new names. By the time this version of the story shows up, the groundwork has been laid for centuries. Flood myths have made us comfortable with near-total destruction. Cyclical cosmologies have made us expect recurring rises and falls. Diffusionist Atlantis theories have taught us to see survivors spreading knowledge behind every impressive ruin. All the Emerald Tablets have to do is take that familiar reset template and say, "You've heard this story before. Now here's the director's cut, from the point of view of the ones who never actually lost anything." To find where this director's cut is supposedly coming from, we have to leave ancient Egypt and classical Greece behind and walk into something much less exotic, early 20th century America. The version of the Emerald Tablets most people mean today, the one with Thoth talking in first person, Atlantean priest kings, underground halls beneath the Sphinx, doesn't come out of a tomb. It comes out of a man named Maurice Doreal. Doreal was an occultist operating in the 1930s and 40s, part of that strange ecosystem of theosophists, spiritualists, Rosicrucians, and fringe Masons that exploded in the late 19th and early 20th century. He founded a group called the Brotherhood of the White Temple in Colorado and presented himself as a kind of conduit for hidden wisdom. In that world, claiming contact with ascended masters, Atlantean adepts, or secret brotherhoods in Tibet was almost a genre requirement. People were hooked on the idea that behind the boring surface of modern life, there was an invisible hierarchy of enlightened beings quietly steering human history. That's the waters Doreal was swimming in when he said he had translated a set of ancient tablets written by Thoth himself. According to his story, these were not the little alchemical aphorisms of the medieval Emerald Tablet. These were great green slabs of Atlantean metal taken from a hall of records hidden somewhere in or under Egypt. He claimed the text was originally written in an Atlantean tongue, encoded, then later translated through his own special access. In other words, no chain of manuscripts, no museum inventory, no dusty scholar in a European library, just a modern initiate saying, "I've been given this." Trust me, what do these Thoth tablets actually claim? They read like a mix of autobiography, initiation manual, and cosmic history lesson. Thoth speaks directly telling you he was a priest king in Atlantis before the Great Cataclysm. He describes a civilization of towering science and spiritual mastery, playing with energies and dimensions that make our physics look like kindergarten. He tells you Atlantis didn't just drown. It was brought down by misuse of that power, by sons of men who turned their faces from the light. And he, along with a select group of initiates, fled the impending destruction. They journeyed to the land that would become Egypt, went deep underground and built halls and chambers where the higher knowledge could be preserved until humanity was ready again. Threaded through the narrative are instructions and hints for the reader initiate. How to awaken the fire within, how to align with cosmic law, how to escape the cycle of rebirth, how to contact the lords of the nine that govern higher dimensions. Time is cyclical, consciousness is layered, and the universe is presented as a living hierarchy of intelligences. It's not just a disaster story, it's a recruitment speech. You, the reader, are being told. The masses forget. Civilizations burn, but there's a lineage that never lost the thread. If you understand these words, you're part of that lineage. And all of this is being framed as the voice of Thoth. That's where the power of the text really sits, and it's also where it collides hard with history. The historical Emerald Tablet, the Tabula Smaragdina, is short. It shows up in the medieval Arabic and Latin alchemical tradition. It has no Atlantis, no first-person memoir of a god, no detailed initiation path, no references to cosmic councils in other dimensions. It's a cryptic, compact statement about the relationship between above and below, spirit and matter transformation and unity. Hermes Trismegistus, the supposed author of that older tablet, is already a composite, a Greco-Egyptian fusion of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth. But the texts associated with him in late antiquity and the Middle Ages have a particular flavour: philosophical dialogues, meditations on mind and cosmos, little technical alchemical writings. They come to us in Greek, Coptic, Arabic, Latin. We can trace manuscripts, quote them, analyse their language. The Dorial Emerald Tablets of Thoth are nothing like that. Different style, different tone, different content, different era. They're written in a kind of occult English prose that sounds very much like early 20th century esoterica. They reference Atlantis, rays, vibrations, dimensions, etheric forces, the vocabulary of theosophy and new thought, not of Ptolemaic Egypt or Hellenistic Alexandria. There is no known ancient Egyptian, Greek or Arabic text that matches Dorial's tablets. No papyrus fragments, no stone inscriptions, no citations from early writers. The only source is Dorial himself, and later reprints by groups who adopted his material. In that sense, the modern Emerald Tablets of Thoth are not a translation of a historical document we can cross-check. They are a new occult composition packaged as an ancient revelation. But the packaging is the point. By attributing the work directly to Thoth, and by equivalence to Hermes Trismegistus, Dorial is plugging into a very old authority structure. For 2,000 years, Hermes said, has been a kind of magical stamp on a text. Renaissance magicians, Islamic alchemists, Christian mystics, all leaned on Hermes Thoth as the primordial sage who knew the secrets of the heavens and handed them down. Attach that name to your ideas, and you're not just some guy in Colorado with a mimeograph machine. You're the mouthpiece of the archetypal teacher of civilization, the god who invented writing, mathematics, and sacred ritual. It also solves a narrative problem. If you want to write a book that explains how Atlantis survived the reset, how its adepts went underground, how they encoded their wisdom for a future age, who could possibly be a better narrator than Thoth himself? He's already associated with Egypt, with hidden books, with weighing souls after death, with time cycles and cosmic order. He's already the one the Greeks merged with Hermes and crowned thrice great. So even though scholars see the Dorial tablets as a modern esoteric text, not an ancient artifact, for many readers the name on the cover overrides the publication date. The attribution creates a shortcut in the brain. Thoth equals Hermes, Hermes equals ancient wisdom. Therefore, whatever he's saying about Atlantis must be some long-buried truth finally surfacing. Once that authority switch flips, the normal questions: where is the manuscript? What language was this in? Who else ever saw it? Can feel almost irrelevant. If Thoth is talking, who are we to demand footnotes? That's the power move of the modern Emerald Tablets. They don't just tell you Atlantis survived the reset. They tell you the surviving Atlantean is the one speaking, and he's the same figure generations of mystics have already been trained to trust. The next step is to ask, if you take a breath and set that authority aside, what does the text itself look like under a cold light? How do researchers actually evaluate a document that claims to be ancient when everything about it screams modern? The first thing scholars do with a supposedly ancient text is incredibly unmystical. They don't meditate on its vibration. They ask, where did this thing actually come from? Not in the cosmic sense, in the paperwork sense, in the real world of manuscripts. Every text has a life history. There's the physical object, a papyrus, a codex, a clay tablet, an inscription. There's the context it was found in, which layer of soil, which temple, which trash pit. There's the chain of custody, who owned it, who copied it, who quoted it, who translated it, how it moved from one library to another over centuries. That web of details is what historians call provenance. And for ancient works we actually take seriously. It's rarely perfect, but it's at least there. Take the historical emerald tablet. We don't have the original engraved on literal emerald. What we have are Arabic texts in medieval manuscripts, then Latin translations, then commentaries from named scholars. We can track how phrases change between copies, who quotes whom, where scribes made mistakes. We can match handwriting styles to particular centuries. We can say by the 9th century this sentence definitely existed in this form. Same with the Hermetic corpus. Scholars can point to specific papyri, bound codices from places like Nag Hammadi, references in church fathers who complain about Hermetic teachings, quotations in Islamic philosophers who respond to Hermes. There's a paper trail. A messy one, but a trail. With Dorial's Emerald Tablets of Thoth, that trail starts and ends in a single place. Maurice Dorial's own publications and lectures in the 20th century. No earlier Greek version. No Coptic fragments. No medieval Arabic paraphrase. No half-erased copy on the wall of a tomb. Just, I translated these from Atlantean Egyptian because I had access to a secret hall of records. From a provenance perspective, that's not a small detail. That's a gaping void when someone claims this is a translation. Scholars immediately ask, translated from what exactly? What language? What script? Where is the original now? Who else ever saw it? Is there a photograph? A rubbing? A catalogue entry from a museum? A note in some early explorer's diary? Even when originals are lost, translations usually leave fingerprints. Medieval translators will say, rendered from the Arabic of so and so. Renaissance occultists proudly list which Greek or Hebrew manuscripts they used. You can often reconstruct lost texts by triangulating a bunch of later quotations and translations. But if the only evidence a prior text ever existed is one modern person insisting, trust me, that's not a reconstruction. That's a revelation claim. And revelation claims might be spiritually meaningful, but they occupy a very different category from this was a document circulating in 200 BCE. The next layer researchers look at is the language itself. Not the content yet, the actual words. Languages are time-stamped. Certain phrases, metaphors, and even sentence rhythms belong to particular eras. If you've ever read something and thought, that sounds so Victorian, or this is painfully 90s, you've already done a crude version of this. Scholars do it much more systematically. They analyze vocabulary, syntax, and stylistic patterns to date texts, and catch anachronisms, things that don't belong to the claimed time period. Imagine someone hands you a lost gospel and Jesus says, I tried to stay low vibe, but their toxic energy was messing with my manifestation. You don't need a PhD to know something's off. Certain ideas simply were not expressed that way in 1st century Aramaic. When you read Dorial's tablets with that in mind, the red flags start popping. The prose is saturated with early 20th century occult buzzwords. Vibrations, etheric forces, rays, planes, masters, initiation, cosmic law, lords of the nine, fire of vibration within the heart. The worldview sounds like theosophy, new thought, Rosicrucian pamphlets and pulp science fiction had a child and dressed it in pseudo-archaic robes. This isn't how Egyptians in the Old Kingdom wrote. It isn't how Hellenistic Hermetic authors wrote. It isn't even how late antique Gnostics wrote. It's how English-speaking esotericists wrote after X-rays, radio waves, and spiritualism had seeped into popular culture. Real ancient texts have their own technical vocabularies, words for Ka and Ba and Mart in Egypt, or nous and logos and pneuma in Greek. They have their own metaphors for soul and cosmos, their own way of stacking images. Even when they talk about light and ascent, their stylistic DNA is different. Doril's Thoth talks like a theosophical lecturer, cosplaying an Atlantean. You also see concept-level anachronisms, ideas that depend on much later frameworks. The tablets casually reference dimensions and vibrations in a way that assumes a familiarity with wave physics, ether theories, and a modern sense of a layered universe that you just don't find articulated like that in actual Egyptian or early Hermetic material. They speak to a reader who has already soaked in 19th and 20th century occult literature, who recognizes phrases like children of the light and cycles of manifestation from Blavatsky, Besant, Bailey and company. That's why scholars call the text modern esoterica wearing an ancient mask. It's not that the ideas are all ridiculous, it's that their packaging belongs to a very specific cultural moment, not to pharaonic Egypt or Platonic Greece. And then there's the silence. For a text that supposedly reveals the secret survival of Atlantis, you would expect something. A rumour, a garbled quote in a medieval grimoire, a weird reference in an Arabic occult encyclopedia, a Renaissance magus hinting at green tables hidden beneath the paws of the lion in Egypt. Anything. Instead, the Thoth Tablets appear fully formed in the 20th century, with no prehistory at all, no independent witnesses, no parallel versions, no competing translations. Nothing to suggest that anyone anywhere had ever heard this exact Atlantis Thoth narrative before Maurice Doreal. From a critical standpoint, that doesn't prove fraud in a courtroom sense, but it absolutely caps what you can responsibly claim. This is where another misconception creeps in, the idea that no evidence is secretly evidence of a cover-up. If you point out the lack of manuscripts or archaeological context, people sometimes jump straight to, of course there's nothing, that proves how hard it's being suppressed, but absence of evidence doesn't automatically mean suppression. It can mean a lot of less exotic things. The text is modern, the story is legendary, the original was private and never widely circulated, or it simply never existed in the form claimed. Historians work with probabilities, not fantasies of absolute certainty. When you have rich provenance, multiple independent witnesses, and language that matches its supposed time, you can tentatively treat a text as historically rooted even if parts of its story are mythic. When you have none of that, you can still read the text, interpret it, even treat it as spiritually valuable, but you have to dial back the historical claims. So with the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the scholarly position is not, this is definitely fake, case closed, go home. It's more precise and more boring. We have no verifiable ancient artifact behind this. The language and concepts are clearly modern, therefore we should read it as a 20th century esoteric composition, not as a literal Atlantean Egyptian document. That doesn't necessarily kill the allure. For many readers, the mythic framing is what matters, not the footnotes. But once you see how provenance, language, and anachronism work, you can hold both levels at once. You can say, as history, this is almost certainly modern. As myth, it's doing something else entirely. And that opens up a different question. One we'll turn to next. If we treat Doreal's tablets as a story, rather than a stone inscription, what story are they actually telling about Atlantis surviving the Cataclysm? What vision of a post-reset world are they trying to plant in your mind? If we set aside the are they ancient question for a moment and just read Doreal's tablets as a narrative, a very specific picture of Atlantis pops out. In this story world, Atlantis doesn't just go down in a random freak disaster. It goes down like a failed spiritual experiment. Thoth keeps repeating a core pattern. There was a high civilization. It misused power. The universe hit reset, and a tiny group of the worthy slipped through the cracks and rebuilt somewhere else. In the tablets, that tiny group is basically Thoth and his initiates. He describes Atlantis as a place of incredible technology and occult mastery, sons of the morning wielding forces of light, manipulating vibration, bending matter and energy. But mixed into that are children of the shadows, beings or people who sink into materialism, power, hunger, and what the text calls dark wisdom. That's the setup for the Cataclysm. The fall of Atlantis in Thoth's telling is not just a tsunami or an asteroid. It's the karmic blowback of abusing cosmic law. The lords of the cycles allow a cleansing. The earth changes, waters rise, fire and upheaval sweep the land. The civilization that once ruled the waves is suddenly fighting for its life. But in the middle of that, a plan is already in motion. Thoth claims he was instructed by higher beings, the Lords of Amenti or Lords of the Nine, to gather a band of initiates and prepare for evacuation. These aren't random refugees. They're the people who have passed through the mysteries, who have learned to walk in the light, who carry the teachings of Atlantis in their memory and in their etheric bodies. According to the tablets, they don't just run inland grabbing whatever they can. They move with purpose. They carry specific things, knowledge of the keys, the laws of vibration and harmony, the memory of cycles, and, crucially, records. This is where the halls come in again and again. Thoth talks about halls of records, halls of Amenti, hidden chambers beneath pyramids and temples. These are not just libraries in the modern sense. They're framed as multi-dimensional archives, places where knowledge is stored in stone, in symbol, and in subtle energy. The story goes like this: before and during the fall, Thoth deposits Atlantean knowledge into these halls, tablets of wisdom, sealed chambers, vibrational records encoded into architecture. Then, when the cataclysm hits and the surface world is wiped clean, the information is safe. Not for everyone, not immediately, but for those in later ages who become worthy to rediscover it. The migration piece is just as specific. After Atlantis sinks, Thoth says he travels with his group to the land of Kem, what we'd call ancient Egypt. In the tablets he presents himself as the culture bringer. He arrives among a more primitive people, bringing the remnants of Atlantean science and spirituality. He raises up those of Kem by giving them law, writing, temple science, and the blueprint for pyramids that are basically solid-state spiritual machines. So who survives? Not Atlantis as a political entity. Not the average Atlantean. The survivors are the initiates, the priest-scientists who've been pre-selected as carriers of the flame. What do they preserve? Not gold, not palaces, but a pattern. The knowledge of how consciousness evolves, how cycles work, how to align with light instead of shadow. Plus literal records, hidden in stone and in the underworld halls waiting for later civilizations to stumble on them or be guided to them. Where do they go? Underground and eastward, into the halls of Amenti beneath the earth, into Egypt. Eventually, according to some tablet passages, into other centres around the globe, seeding mystery schools that pop up as echoes of the original Atlantean initiation. All of this is framed as a reset, but not the way a disaster movie frames it. In the tablet's logic, collapse is a test, almost an exam administered by cosmic proctors. When a civilization rises high enough to manipulate powerful forces, its shadow gets amplified too. If it fails to integrate that shadow, if it uses its power to dominate rather than harmonize, the universe doesn't shrug. It sends a corrective event. The Cataclysm is that corrective. People who are locked into materialism go down with the physical structures they worship. People who have aligned with light are given a way through, sometimes literally through tunnels and ships and hidden halls, sometimes metaphorically through inner transformation that lets them incarnate again as leaders of a new cycle. In other words, the reset is moralized. It isn't bad luck, it's portrayed as a law-governed response to spiritual imbalance. Atlantis doesn't just drown, it fails a cosmic audit. That framing is part of why the story works so powerfully even if you don't buy a single historical claim. On one level, it's a fantasy of continuity. The idea that somewhere beneath the churn of history, a chain of wise beings has kept the real knowledge safe. No matter how many empires collapse, the core teaching never quite dies. It just retreats into a hall, a cave, a secret order waiting for the right moment to surface again. On another level, it's a way to make sense of collapse itself. If you've ever looked at history or the present and thought, how can entire civilizations do this to themselves? The Thoth narrative gives you an answer. Because they abandon inner law, because they mistake technology for wisdom, and when they do, they eventually trigger a reset. Not purely random, not purely punishment, but a forced opportunity to start over on better terms. Then there's the personal hook. Readers aren't just told, Atlantis survived through some priests long ago. They're invited to imagine themselves as those priests' heirs. You, right now, reading this modern tablet, might be one of the souls who walked those halls, who survived that flood, who promised to return in a future age to help humanity through the next reset. That's an incredibly potent story to inhabit. It turns global anxiety about environmental collapse, war, and end times into something you might have trained for across lifetimes. It gives catastrophe meaning. It suggests that even if the outer structures burn, there is an inner line of continuity that can't be wiped out by water or fire. Whether you see that as literal reincarnation history, modern myth-making, or pure metaphor, the pattern it offers is the same. Civilizations rise, fall, and reset, but a thread of consciousness survives the cataclysm, carrying memory forward. And in Doriel's version of the tablets, that thread has a name, Thoth, the Atlantean who refuses to let Atlantis fully die. In the next step, people take that claim one move further. If Thoth and his initiates walked out of a sinking continent and into the Nile Valley, does that mean Egypt is basically Atlantis 2.0 in disguise? That's where the story starts to anchor itself in real geography, and where the temptation to rewrite Egyptian history kicks into high gear. Thoth is the perfect character for that rewrite, because in actual Egyptian religion, he's already doing half the jobs the modern story wants him to do. In the texts we can date, Thoth isn't an alien, or an Atlantean refugee, or a guy hiding crystals under the pyramids. He's a god with very specific roles. He's the scribe of the gods, the measurer, the counter of years and stars, the one who writes ma'at, meaning he records and maintains cosmic order. He's tied to the moon, to timekeeping, to calculation. When the gods weigh a dead person's heart against the feather of truth, Thoth is the one standing there, tablet in hand, writing down the result. He's also linked to language itself. Egyptian texts credit him with inventing writing. Not secret Atlantean glyphs, just writing. The ability to put words into symbols so they can last beyond a single breath. He mediates disputes between gods. He heals the broken eye of Horus. He helps resurrect Osiris. Over and over, Thoth shows up as the one who knows the right words, the right formulas, the right timing to restore balance. So in the original context, he's already a kind of divine intellectual, patron of scribes, of priests doing ritual correctly, of astronomer priests tracking the heavens from temple roofs. He's not a random war god you'd have to retrofit into being a sage. He's already the archetype of knowledge with a capital K. That alone makes him irresistible for later reinterpretation. Now watch what happens over the centuries. The Greeks show up in Egypt. They see this ibis-headed, baboon-associated deity who's in charge of writing, mathematics, and cosmic law. They already have their own god of cleverness, writing, trickery, and crossroads, Hermes. So they do what ancient peoples did all the time. They say, "Oh, that guy? That's our guy, just with a different name." Thoth becomes Hermes in Greek eyes. Not literally, but conceptually. In Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, you start getting this blended figure, Hermes Thoth, and as philosophical and mystical traditions grow around him, he gets a new title, Trismegistus. Thrice great, Hermes Trismegistus is presented as a primordial sage, a culture hero who knew astronomy, medicine, ritual, philosophy. In late antique texts, he's the one delivering discourses on the nature of the cosmos, the soul, and the divine mind. This is where Hermeticism comes from, a whole current of thought that sees the universe as a living, ensouled reality structured by correspondences between above and below. So now you've got a chain already forming. Thoth, Egyptian god of writing and cosmic order, Hermes Thoth, Greek-Egyptian wisdom figure, Hermes Trismegistus, quasi-mythic author of deep esoteric texts. Later esoteric writers only have to add one more link, Atlantis. Once you decide that the deepest wisdom is primordial, older than Egypt, older than Greece, and that Hermes Thoth is the custodian of that wisdom, it's a tiny step to say he brought it from a vanished world. Plato has already put Atlantis on the map of the imagination. Hermeticism is already associated with ancient Egypt, so the bridge appears almost by itself. Thoth, Hermes, Hermeticism, ancient mystery science, Atlantis. By the time you get to 19th and 20th century occultism, this bridge is fully built. The narrative flips. Instead of Egypt being the origin point, it becomes the second stop. A colony of something earlier and higher. Egypt got its wisdom from Atlantis is already circulating in theosophy and related movements decades before. Doriel writes his Emerald Tablets. And that's where Egyptomania takes over. For European and American audiences, Egypt is the perfect stage. It's undeniably ancient. It has massive stone architecture that still looks futuristic. It's covered in symbols nobody could read until very recently in historical terms. For centuries, Egyptian hieroglyphs were literally taken as magical characters, rather than a working writing system. So you get this feedback loop. Pyramids and temples feel mysterious. People don't understand the language or the culture. They project timeless secret knowledge into the gaps. Every untranslated or half-understood symbol becomes a potential clue to a lost science. Add in colonial archaeology, Western powers digging up tombs, removing mummies, hauling obelisks back to European capitals, and you get a situation where Egyptian culture is being displayed as an exotic puzzle box. A stage set for whatever story you want to tell. Occult authors absolutely take advantage of that. They point to pyramid alignments and say, proof of star maps from a forgotten age. They point to underground chambers and say, entrance to Atlantean halls of records. They see Thoth depicted with a writing palette and stylus and say, this is the scribe of a pre-flood world delivering his science to a younger civilization. The modern Emerald Tablets slot right into that framework. When Doriel's Thoth says he fled Atlantis and built pyramids in the land of Chem, he's tapping directly into that Egyptomania. He's anchoring a mythic reset into a real landscape people recognize. You can stand at Giza, look up at millions of tons of stone and think, this is where the Atlanteans survived. The temptation is strong because it does two things at once. It turns Egypt into a kind of sequel, Atlantis 2.0, rebuilt on the Nile. And it turns the Egyptian record, the hieroglyphs, the temple reliefs, the funerary texts, into an enormous cipher that only the initiated can decode properly. If you're outside the tradition, you think it's about Ra and Osiris and the pharaoh's afterlife. If you're in the know, you think it's secretly about cosmic cycles, interdimensional halls, vibration technology. But this is where we have to draw some careful lines. Historically, we have a lot of data on Egypt. We have king lists, tax records, legal documents, letters, medical texts, astronomical observations, construction inscriptions. We can track the evolution of the language from Old Egyptian to Demotic. We can see how gods like Thoth are described across more than 2,000 years. In all that, Thoth is many things: lunar, intellectual, ritual, judicial. But he is not described by Egyptians as a refugee from a sunken island west of the Pillars of Heracles. He is not framed as an immortal Atlantean who survived a global reset. That layer appears much, much later, when non-Egyptian traditions start remixing him. Does that mean the symbolism is meaningless? Not at all. You can absolutely read Thoth as an archetype of continuity of knowledge across cycles. You can see the pyramids as symbolic mountains tying heaven and earth. You can explore Hermetic texts as poetic maps of inner transformation. Those are valid symbolic, psychological, or spiritual readings. But when we shift from symbolically, Thoth is the guardian of timeless wisdom, to historically, Thoth was a literal Atlantean who landed in pre-dynastic Egypt and built the pyramids with vibration tech. We've left the ground of what the evidence can support. That doesn't make mythic readings worthless. It just means we should be honest about what game we're playing. On one level, Thoth is an Egyptian god with clear roles in a very human, very traceable religious system. On another, he's become a cross-cultural emblem of hidden knowledge, stitched together from Greek philosophy, late antique mysticism, Renaissance magic, and modern occult speculation. Egypt sits at the crossroads of those layers. It's where a real ancient civilization gets drafted as the stage for a lost one. And when you're holding a text that claims Atlantis survived by going underground in Chem, it's incredibly tempting to fuse those two into one seamless story. Next, we'll push on that fusion. If Egypt really were Atlantis in disguise, what would we expect to see in the ground, in the texts, in the stones, and what do we actually find when we look? If Egypt became the stage, mystery schools became the script. Once you tell people that there is an older, deeper layer of truth beneath the visible religion, the next move almost writes itself. Somebody had to guard that deeper layer. Not the average temple goer, not the village farmer bringing offerings. A select group, an inner circle. The initiates, initiation stories, whether ancient or modern, almost always follow the same skeleton. First, separation. You're taken out of ordinary life. In older myths, that might mean literally going into the desert, entering a cave, being blindfolded and led underground. In modern occult systems, it might be framed as leaving profane consciousness behind. Either way, you cross a line. There's a before and an after. Second, ordeal or testing. You're put through something that, at least symbolically, could break you. Fasting, vigils, frightening symbols, oaths of secrecy, being confronted with your own fear and ignorance. You're told directly or indirectly, most people couldn't handle this. Let's see if you can. Third, revelation. A teaching, a symbol system, a ritual pattern is open to you. Maybe you're given a new name, a password, a sign only insiders know. In narrative terms, this is the moment the curtain pulls back. What was hidden becomes visible, but only to you and your new brothers and sisters. Finally, transformation. You're no longer who you were at the start. You've been reborn, enlightened, awakened, leveled up, choose your metaphor. And crucially, you're now under some obligation, to guard the secret, to serve the tradition. to help others rise when they're ready. The modern emerald tablets lean hard into this structure. Thoth doesn't just say, "Here's some information." He speaks in stages, from darkness to light, from ignorance to understanding, from man to adept. He hints at trials, at descending into chambers of initiation, at standing before beings who measure your worth. He presents knowledge not as a public library, but as something you can only access if you have the right vibration, the right courage, the right guide. You can see the same bones in a lot of 19th and 20th century occult literature. The language shifts, but the tropes stay the same. There's always a brotherhood or order, the Great White Brotherhood, the Masters of Wisdom, the Rosicrucian Fraternity, the Inner School. They live in remote monasteries in Tibet, or hidden lodges under European cities, or etheric retreats in the Himalayas, or conveniently in higher dimensions inaccessible to mainstream science. There are always adepts and neophytes. The neophyte is you, the reader, the seeker, blind, hungry, worthy but unformed. The adept is the one who has passed through the gates, mastered the forces, decoded the ciphers. He, or sometimes she, but usually he is presented as calm, detached, slightly beyond ordinary human emotion. He speaks in aphorisms and paradoxes. He sees the big cycles. He hints that he has lived many lives. And there is always a line, the teaching they don't want you to have. They might be ignorant priests, dogmatic scientists, corrupt politicians, demonic forces, or just the masses who wouldn't understand. The point is to create a closed circuit. Truth flows from hidden masters, through initiatory texts and rituals, to a small circle of prepared souls. Everyone else is outside, in the dark. This taps directly into something very old in us. Humans are wired for in-groups and out-groups. For most of our species' history, belonging to the right group wasn't just comforting, it was life or death. You needed to know the hunting grounds, the water holes, the kinship rules. That knowledge was mostly oral, mostly guarded, mostly transmitted through trust networks. Initiation lore hijacks that wiring. When a book tells you, most will mock this, but a few will understand, it's flattering you into an in-group that doesn't technically exist. When a narrator says, the profane believe this is just a tomb, but the initiate knows it is an energy device, they're offering you an invisible membership card. The psychology is powerful, you get a sense of specialness. You're not just another person scrolling, you're a candidate for hidden wisdom. A sense of narrative clarity. There are guardians, suppressors, tests, allies. Life becomes a story with roles and arcs, a shield against criticism. If experts disagree, well, that just proves they're outside the mystery. Your very isolation becomes evidence you're on the right track. My eyes were opened to what they hid is one of the most addictive story structures on the internet for exactly this reason. It gives you an enemy, they, a secret, and a hero's journey that you can live in your head while sitting on your couch. The Emerald Tablets of Thoth plug into that perfectly. They talk about hidden halls beneath the pyramids, secret chambers where light-born masters wait, tests of courage and purity, knowledge that must not be given to the unready. They echo Masonic rites, Rosicrucian manifestos, Theosophical Mahatmas, Golden Dawn grades. It's the same engine, just reskinned with Atlantean tech and Egyptian scenery. None of this automatically makes the content worthless. Initiation narratives can be powerful tools for inner work. Symbolically, descending into the underworld, facing the guardians, dying to the old self map very well onto real psychological processes, confronting trauma, breaking habits, going through crisis, and coming out changed. The problem starts when we forget which level we're on. If you take mystery school language as poetic, Thoth's halls are your unconscious, the guardians are your fears, the light in the chamber is insight, then the Emerald Tablets become a kind of elaborate guided meditation, a mythic framework for inner transformation. In that mode, secrecy and stages make a certain sense. You don't dump your hardest truths on day one. You build capacity. You earn trust. You move gradually. If you take the same language as literal history, Thoth really ran a secret Atlantean engineering academy under Giza, with levitating chairs and death rays, and the only reason we don't see it is that they covered it up. Then you're playing a different game. You've turned an inner drama into a missing chapter of archaeology. And that's where a lot of Atlantis discourse gets tangled. People feel a genuine pull toward transformation, purpose, and belonging. They find that in initiation stories. Then those psychological needs get stapled onto claims about physical tunnels and pre-flood civilizations. Question the tunnels, and it can feel like you're questioning the transformation. You don't have to do that. You can enjoy the initiation pattern, feel its emotional power, use its symbols, without assigning it to a specific lost epoch on the geological timescale. You can say this reads like a mystery school text, and then ask, okay, mystery of what? The soul? Consciousness? Power structures? Instead of defaulting to mystery of Atlantean death lasers. In other words, the choice isn't between this is literal secret history and this is garbage. There's a third option. This is mythic psychology dressed in historical cosplay. Keeping that distinction clear matters, especially when we start comparing the tablets' cataclysms and initiations with actual records of floods, fires, and ice ages. Which is where we're headed next. Because if the Emerald Tablets are really preserving memories of a world reset, they shouldn't just resonate with our desire to feel special. They should line up, at least in outline, with what the planet itself remembers. When people talk about resets, they're not just inventing something out of nowhere. Catastrophe is one of humanity's oldest storytelling languages. Everywhere you look in the world's myth libraries, you see the same handful of disaster templates getting remixed. Floods, fire, darkness, freezing cold, the sky itself coming loose. Start with water, because that's the big one. In Mesopotamia, you have Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh building a boat to survive a divine flood. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah in India, Manu warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha floating over a drowned world. In parts of Mesoamerica, whole previous humanities wiped out by water. You could play mythic bingo across continents and the world is drowned. A small group survives on something that floats and then repopulates would be the center square. Then there's fire. Zoroastrian texts talk about molten metal sweeping the earth at the end of a world cycle. Some Native American traditions remember skies on fire or a burning rain. In the Greek stories, Phaethon loses control of the sun chariot, scorching the earth before Zeus knocks him down. In Hindu cosmology, one of the ways a world age ends is with Shiva's fire consuming creation. Or take darkness and celestial upheaval. The Norse Ragnarok isn't just a battle, it's the sun swallowed, stars vanishing, earth sinking into the sea. In Mesoamerican lore, different suns or ages end with the sky going wrong, jaguars, winds, floods, darkness. Chinese myths describe pillars of heaven breaking, the sky tilting, floods, and fire pouring in. And underneath all of this, there's the idea of repeated world ages. Hesiod in Greece lays out a sequence of races, gold, silver, bronze, heroes, iron, each one morally and cosmically different. Hinduism talks about yugas, Satya Yuga, Treta, Dvapara, Kali, long cycles of rising and falling virtue, each ending in some kind of reset before the wheel turns again. The Maya have their Bactans and previous creations. The Andean world has Pachacuti, world turnings where order flips. The modern Atlantis reset narrative is basically a remix of all of that with a technological skin. Instead of the gods flood the wicked world, it's a high-tech civilization is wiped out when the planetary cycle turns. Instead of Age of Bronze gives way to Age of Iron, its Atlantean Golden Age gives way to our fallen post-cataclysmic state. The emotional structure is the same. There was a time before. Something huge happened. Only a remnant survived, and we live in the ruins of that event, usually morally downgraded. So what are these stories actually doing? There are a few layers, and they don't cancel each other out. 1. Memory. Cultures absolutely can preserve blurred memories of real disasters. If your ancestors lived through a megaflood, or saw a volcano erase a coastline, they didn't have seismographs or satellite data. They had poems, rituals, oral histories. The world ended might be the best language they had, for our entire region was annihilated. 2. Metaphor. Floods aren't just about water. They're about being overwhelmed. Fire isn't just lava, it's rage, war, fever, social breakdown. A story where the gods burned the world because humans were corrupt functions as a psychological mirror. It tells you human behavior has consequences so big they feel cosmic. 3. Moral teaching. World-age myths are a neat way to talk about ethics and power without naming names. If you tell people we're in the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, you're also saying, don't be shocked that things feel corrupt. Here's how to live decently anyway. The end-of-age catastrophe becomes a warning and a promise. Behave, or you'll help burn it down. Behave, and maybe you'll be part of what survives. The Emerald Tablets of Thoth, at least in the modern version, plug themselves into this whole system. They talk about darkness covering the land, the earth convulsing, Atlantean halls sinking, survivors sailing to a new world to seed a younger, less advanced humanity. They frame it as both literal cataclysm and spiritual allegory. The outer world falls into chaos, while the inner adepts, the children of light, carry knowledge through the storm. That's basically the flood template and the world age template welded together. Atlantis becomes the climax of a previous cycle. The reset is the break between world ages. Thoth is Noah, Manu, Utnapishtim, but instead of animals he's carrying geometry, vibration and light wisdom, and the tablets position you, the reader, as someone recontacting that pre-reset knowledge right as another cycle threatens to turn. This is why it feels so powerful. You're not just reading about disaster, you're being cast into the role of the small band that remembers, the meta-population node that makes it through when everything else dies. Where this gets tricky is in how some modern narratives handle similarity. Once you notice that lots of cultures have flood stories and fire stories and world age stories, it's tempting to jump straight to C. They're obviously all describing the same single global event. One Atlantis, one flood, one reset. That's the trap. Humans are pattern spotting machines. We're very good at seeing echoes and very bad at remembering how many different things can produce similar stories. You roast a landscape with a regional wildfire. People will say the world burned. You drown a river valley under a glacial lake outburst. People will say the world flooded. You live through a decade of failed monsoons, plagues and war. People will say we're in the end times and the age is collapsing. You don't need one global superflood for floods to be a core mythic image. You don't need a literal pole shift for the sky turning to become a symbol of social or cosmic breakdown. Different groups facing different disasters will reach for similar metaphors because they live in the same kind of nervous system and look up at the same sky. So when we put the Emerald Tablets Atlantean reset next to other catastrophe myths, we should hold two ideas at once. Yes, They're participating in a very old, very human storytelling pattern about cycles and wipeouts. That makes them easier to understand and gives them deep psychological resonance. No, that does not automatically mean there are one pristine, unbroken eyewitness report of a single lost global civilization. To figure out what, if anything, in these myths maps onto real events, we have to step out of the story structure and look at the planet itself, the sediments, the ice cores, the crater fields, the ruins. In other words, we have to ask what Earth's own memory says about resets. That's where we're going next if you zoom out from the myths and look at the actual planet. You don't see one neat, movie-ready global reset. You see a whole catalogue of regional catastrophes big enough to feel like the end of the world to the people who lived through them. And these are the kinds of events that keep getting recruited into the Atlantis story. Start with the basics. What can actually erase a city, redraw a coastline, and traumatize a culture badly enough that the memory might echo for centuries? 4 main culprits show up again and again: earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and sea level rise. Earthquakes are the quietest in the long term, but the most shocking in the moment. One bad fault slip and the ground under your feet turns to liquid. Buildings collapse, harbours tilt. Whole sections of coastline can uplift or subside by meters. If your city was built right along a tectonic boundary, and most great trading ports are, an earthquake can shatter stone temples, split roads, knock statues into the sea. Add water to that, and you get tsunamis. If you live on a low-lying coast and a major underwater quake or landslide hits offshore, you don't just get big waves. You get walls of water tens of meters high, moving faster than you can run. They chew up houses, fields, ships, people, and then pull the wreckage back out with them. To survivors clinging to the hills, it really would look like the ocean decided to invade the land. Now combine earthquakes, tsunamis, and fire, and you have volcanoes. Volcanic eruptions are like nature's special effects reel. Ash columns that turn day to night, lightning storms inside the plume, rivers of lava. If the eruption is explosive enough, you can lose part of a mountain in a single blast, and generate tsunamis from the collapsing caldera. Downwind, ash can bury entire regions, suffocate crops, poison water, and make it snow black for months. And then there's the slow killer, sea level rise. At the end of the last ice age, between about 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, global sea level rose on the order of 120 meters as ice sheets melted. Not all at once, not overnight, but in pulses. From the perspective of geology, this is gradual. From the perspective of coastal villages that kept having to move their shrines back from the shoreline every few generations, it would feel like the ocean was eating the world. You can already see how this maps onto the Atlantis script. Land that sank beneath the waves, temples that the sea swallowed, coasts that used to be dry land now hiding under shallow continental shelves. You don't have to invent an advanced crystal civilization to get that imagery. You just have to live in the wrong place at the wrong time, with no satellites and a lot of imagination. The most famous candidate that people point to as the real Atlantis is the eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around the mid-2nd millennium BCE. Picture a circular island in the Aegean with a thriving Bronze Age port town perched on its inner rim. Pottery, frescoes, multi-story houses, trade goods from across the eastern Mediterranean. This was part of the Minoan world, a seafaring civilization based on Crete that was doing shipborne commerce and palace bureaucracy, while much of Europe was still fairly simple. Then the volcano under Thera blew. Not just a pretty lava fountain, a colossal caldera-forming eruption. It blasted out a huge chunk of the island, leaving the hollowed-out crescent shape you see today. Ash fell over wide areas, tsunamis raced across the Aegean, slamming into coastlines, including northern Crete. If you'd been a sailor in that world, this might well have been the most terrifying thing anyone had ever seen. Here's why it gets pulled into the Atlantis conversation. First, the timing. The Thera eruption lines up, more or less, with an era of disruption in the eastern Mediterranean. Damaged Minoan coastal sites, political shifts, trade patterns changing. Some scholars think it weakened Minoan power, setting the stage for Mycenaean Greeks to take over. Second, the aesthetics. Excavations at Akrotiri on Santorini reveal a sophisticated town with paved streets, drains, elaborate art. Not flying saucer docks, but clearly not a backwater village either. It's easy to squint at that and say, a high civilization wiped out by the sea. Third, the geography. You have an island civilization, a catastrophic eruption, a vanished central island, and Greeks later telling stories about an advanced island society that angered the gods and sank. The pattern-seeking parts of our brains start firing. But there are serious caveats. Plato, our only primary source for Atlantis, sets his story 9,000 years before his time, which would be around 9,600 BCE if taken literally, far earlier than the Bronze Age Minoans and the Thera blast. He also places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which most ancient writers took to mean beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, not in the Aegean. On top of that, the Minoans didn't vanish in a single night. They seem to have suffered, adapted, declined, and been absorbed over generations. Their palaces were rebuilt after earlier quakes and fires. This isn't a one-shot reset where the whole culture sinks in a single tantrum of the gods, so Thera is less likely to be Atlantis itself, and more likely to be one member of a family of events that teach people, at a gut level, what it looks like when the world breaks. It's the same story with other candidates. People point at Helike, a Greek city reportedly swallowed by the sea after an earthquake in 373 BCE. They point at Doggerland, the now submerged land between Britain and mainland Europe, that was gradually drowned as the Ice Age ended. They point at massive tsunamis like the Storegga slide off Norway, which sent waves crashing into coasts around the North Atlantic about 8,000 years ago. Any one of these, to the cultures directly hit, could feel like the world ended, a fishing people losing their entire low-lying territory to the encroaching North Sea don't need a global conspiracy. They need a story that explains why their grandparents' hunting grounds are now underwater. This is the key move. Real disasters imprint themselves on memory, oral, ritual, and eventually written, but memory is not a GoPro recording. It compresses, exaggerates, moralizes. A tsunami that devastated 3 coastal towns becomes "the ocean swallowed our ancestors' cities." An eruption that blacked out the sky for a week becomes "the sun went dark and the age ended." A century of rising seas becomes "once the land stretched far beyond the waves." By the time philosophers, priests, and mystery writers get their hands on those fragments, they're not just doing journalism, they're doing cosmology and ethics. They wrap raw trauma in meaning. Atlantis, in that sense, doesn't need to map cleanly onto one single geological event. It can be a composite, a mythic megacity built out of echoes from many real catastrophes. Islands lost here, coastlines drowned there, cities toppled by quakes over there. And uncertainty is what keeps the engine running. We don't know every detail of sea level rise on every ancient coastline. We don't have written records from every culture that watched their harbours disappear. We can see tsunami deposits in sediments, but we can't always match them to a specific story. That gap between we know something happened and we know exactly what and to whom is where imagination rushes in. For some people, that imagination produces careful hypotheses. Maybe this flood tradition in this region remembers this specific outburst flood or that particular slide. For others, it produces grand unifying epics. All floods are one flood, all disasters are one reset, and Atlantis was the master civilization at the center of it all. The Earth gives us plenty of real catastrophes. The Emerald Tablets and their Atlantean reset narrative give us one possible way of stringing those catastrophes together into a single dramatic arc. The real question is, when we leave the stories and look at the ruins, does the physical evidence ever start to look like the Atlantis plot? Or does it tell a very different tale about how civilizations actually rise, fall, and sometimes vanish? That's where we're headed next. If you want to move from cool story to this probably happened, you have to change the kind of evidence you're willing to accept. Myths, visions, and channeled texts can suggest ideas. They can't on their own locate a real civilization in time and space. For that, archaeology needs a different toolkit. 3 things matter a lot. You need sites you can date, you need things people actually made and used, and you need some way to link those things into a continuous story. First, datable sites. If Atlantis is supposed to be a real, sophisticated culture that flourished, built cities, and then was destroyed in some cataclysmic reset, there should be ruins. Not just a few odd stones or a lone pyramid-shaped hill, but a spread of settlements, ports, inland towns, farms, shrines. Those ruins need to sit in layers of earth you can date with more than vibes. Archaeologists use radiocarbon dating on organic material, thermoluminescence on heated objects like pottery and bricks, dendrochronology on wood when they're lucky, and stratigraphy, the order of soil layers themselves. If a civilization supposedly peaked 12,000 years ago, you expect its cities to be buried in layers that consistently test around that age. And if an advanced maritime civilization really got wiped out by the ocean, you'd expect a pattern, a cluster of similarly aged coastal sites, maybe a tsunami deposit on top of them, maybe a layer of marine sediments where a harbour used to be. Second, inscriptions and writing. We're not talking about a scattered symbol here and there. We're talking about a literate, knowledge-keeping culture that, in the Emerald Tablets version, mastered cosmic laws, initiation systems, maybe even technology advanced for its time. History shows us what that looks like. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Maya, all left writing. Clay tablets with accounting entries. Stone stelae with royal boasts. Temple walls with hymns and cosmologies, even if not every person was literate. States that build monumental architecture and long-distance trade networks usually need some form of record-keeping. If Atlantis had that level of complexity, we'd expect either its own writing system preserved somewhere, or at least references to it in neighbouring cultures' texts. We traded with the island people who wrote like this. We captured a scribe from the Western Sea. That kind of thing. Third, material culture and continuity. Civilizations have styles, habits, technological signatures. Roman pottery has a certain look. Classic Egyptian temples share architectural rules. Chinese bronze casting has a unique chemistry. Even when a culture collapses, its fingerprints linger in the cultures that follow. Design motifs, building techniques, metalworking methods, religious symbols. If an Atlantean culture was really the mother civilization behind Egypt, Mesoamerica, and everyone else, as some Emerald Tablet readings imply, there should be some unifying material thread running through those places that can't be explained by independent invention or later contact. That might look like a distinctive alloy recipe that shows up on both sides of the Atlantic at the same time, or a complex engineering trick used in two cultures that had no evident way to influence each other. So far, that's not what we see. What we actually have when we dig into real dirt is a patchwork. Regional traditions that make sense in their local environments, evolving step by step. Egyptian pyramids come out of earlier Egyptian mastabas and tomb architecture. Mesoamerican pyramids grow out of long local traditions of platform mounds and ritual sites. You can track the changes. You don't hit a sudden Atlantean layer that appears fully formed and then vanishes. This is where underwater archaeology comes in, and where Atlantis gets its best alibi. Lots of the world's ancient coastlines are now underwater. As we talked about, sea levels rose dramatically after the last ice age, flooding river mouths, coastal plains, and low-lying islands. If you wanted to hide the ruins of a seafaring culture, the continental shelves are about as good a place as any. But working out there is brutal. Most of the seafloor is deep, dark, and covered in layers of sediment. Even on shallower shelves, waves and currents chew up and redistribute sand. Organic materials rot, wood disintegrates, metal corrodes. To find a site, you need sonar surveys, submersibles, divers, careful mapping. It's slow, expensive work. So yes, absence of evidence, especially underwater, is not simple. We absolutely have not mapped and excavated every submerged coastline on Earth. There is room in the data for surprises, drowned villages, unknown harbours, maybe even substantial towns. At the same time, you can't turn "we haven't looked everywhere" into anything could be true. The ocean doesn't erase everything equally. Stone structures can survive a very long time underwater. So can ceramics, stone tools, and sometimes even inscriptions. We have Phoenician shipwrecks, Bronze Age anchors, Roman ports, submerged Neolithic villages. If there was a globally influential Atlantis with large stone cities and vast trade hubs, you'd expect at least some unambiguous remains to have turned up by now in the places we have surveyed. Distinctive architecture on the seabed, exotic artifacts in known shipwrecks, inscriptions washed down into harbour sediments. What we actually see are more modest, local stories. Sunken Neolithic settlements off Israel, submerged temple platforms off India, the remains of ancient harbours in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Each one fascinating, each one telling us that coastal people adapted to rising seas and shifting shorelines, but none that obviously match Plato's concentric ring supercity or the Emerald Tablets' hyper-advanced mystery empire. In that gap, misidentifications flourish. A circular rock formation in the Sahara becomes the Eye of Atlantis. Natural ridges on the seafloor get labelled Atlantean roads. Ordinary Bronze Age anchor stones or harbour blocks are blown up into megalithic technology because they're big and underwater. Experts look at these and stay unconvinced, not because they're allergic to mystery, but because the details don't add up. The dates are wrong. The supposed walls line up with known geological structures. The stones were clearly quarried and placed by cultures we already know about. Or in the case of satellite and Google Earth Atlantean cities, the patterns disappear when you check higher resolution imagery or send a boat. None of this means we should sneer at every bold claim. Honest inquiry often starts with weird anomalies. A farmer hits a carved stone while ploughing. A diver spots worked blocks on a shelf. A sonar operator notices a suspiciously regular bump. The right response isn't "Atlantis confirmed" or "shut up, idiot." It's "okay, let's test this." That means asking simple, disciplined questions. Can we date it independently? Are there multiple lines of evidence, artifacts, structures, environmental data that point to the same conclusion? Does this site fit within what we already know about the region's geology and archaeology, or does it require rewriting everything? If it does, is the evidence proportionally strong? Applied to the Emerald Tablets version of Atlantis, those questions are brutal. We don't have inscriptions from an Atlantean capital. We don't have a clearly datable, out-of-place complex that predates known civilizations by thousands of years and shows higher engineering. We don't have a trail of artifacts that looks like a mother culture exporting its style to everyone else, and then getting wiped out. What we do have are genuine, dramatic disasters, drowned coasts, and plenty of room to imagine lost towns and even regional cultures that haven't been found yet. And we have a text claiming to be a survivor's testimony from a civilization that left almost no physical trace. To bridge that gap, some people treat the tablets as literal history that archaeology just hasn't caught up to yet. Others read them as something else entirely, as metaphors wearing Atlantean costumes. Before we decide which lens makes more sense, we need to look more closely at what the tablets are doing on the inside, the symbols they use, the way they talk about initiation and light, and why so many people feel like they're reading a map of inner transformation dressed up as a tale of drowned continents. One way to make the emerald tablets instantly less frustrating is to change the target you're aiming at. Instead of asking, "Where was this?" you ask, "What in me is this talking about?" Under that lens, Atlantis stops being a vanished island and turns into a state of being. A golden age not of marble temples and crystal generators, but of inner order. A psyche where the different parts of you, instinct, emotion, intellect, intuition, are actually coordinated. A city where everything is aligned around a central axis of meaning. When the tablets describe a radiant, harmonious civilization that falls because of corruption, imbalance, or misuse of power, you can read that as psychology in story form. An ordered inner world that gets hijacked by fear, ego, obsession, addiction, whatever your personal version of dark forces looks like. In that reading, the reset isn't an asteroid. It's the moment your inner arrangements collapse. The depression that wipes out your old motivations. The burnout that makes your previous ambitions feel pointless. The crisis that shatters a belief system you thought was bedrock. The flood doesn't hit the coastline. It hits the story you tell yourself about who you are and why your life makes sense. And notice how often the tablets talk about descent, darkness, and emergence. Thoth goes into the underworld, confronts shadowy entities, gains knowledge, and rises again. That's almost a textbook initiation pattern. You see the same shape in myth after myth. Inanna's descent, Orpheus in Hades, Christ in the tomb, the alchemical Nigredo. You could call it a dramatized nervous breakdown that turns into a restructuring. Hermetic and alchemical traditions are obsessed with that loop. On the surface, they talk about furnaces and flasks, sulfur and mercury, metals being purified and transformed. But most serious readers, even in the Renaissance, didn't think you were literally going to get immortality serum out of a backyard lab. They treated the lab as a mirror for the soul. Lead into gold becomes ignorance into wisdom, instinct into insight, chaos into a stable, integrated self. When the Emerald Tablet says, in its classic Latin version, "Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity," that maps surprisingly well onto inner work. You're learning to notice crude impulses and finer perceptions, to distinguish them without hating either, and to recombine them in a healthier order. Ascend from the earth to heaven, and descend again to earth, and receive the power of the things above and below. That sounds like a poetic way of saying, move between raw experience and abstract understanding until they actually talk to each other. Ground your ideals in your body and your behaviour. Now take the expanded modern Thoth tablets that drape this in Atlantean drama. A hall of Amenti, where souls sleep and awaken. Children of light trapped in matter. Lords of the dark that feed on fear. A teacher who survives a cataclysm and preserves knowledge for a future age. You don't have to believe there is a literal cavern under Egypt with cryo-chambers full of Atlantean priests for this to be useful. You can read Amenti as the unconscious, the repository of forgotten patterns and ancestral baggage. The children of light as your capacities, creativity, courage, love, buried under conditioning. The lords of the dark as habits and thought forms that keep you cycling in the same loops. In that frame, Thoth is less an alien engineer and more the part of you that can stay conscious during upheaval, the witness that doesn't get completely swept away when your old life collapses. The faculty that can remember there is something beyond the current disaster, and that uses the breakdown to reorganize on a deeper level, instead of just trying to rebuild the same fragile structure. Even the idea that Atlantis survived the reset takes on a different flavor. Maybe that means the pattern survived. The memory of a more coherent way of being is still present in human consciousness, even if no physical city did. The tablets become a reminder that beneath the rubble of whatever catastrophe you're facing, personal or collective, there's an underlying architecture you can rediscover. This symbolic reading lines up well with classic Hermetic ideas. As above, so below isn't just about planets and pyramids. It's about nested levels of reality mirroring each other. Cosmic cycles reflect psychological cycles. Civilizations rise, overreach, collapse, and sometimes renew. So do individuals, so do belief systems. Alchemical texts constantly talk about solving and coagulating, dissolving fixed forms, then recrystallizing them on a new basis. That's exactly what a reset looks like when you describe it from the inside. Your identity dissolves. It's terrifying. Then, if you navigate it well, you set in a new, more conscious pattern. If you adopt this approach, something important happens. The tablets don't need to be literally ancient to matter. A 20th century author tapping into old Hermetic imagery can still produce a potent symbolic map. Fiction can still carry real patterns. The fact that an image is late or channeled or visionary doesn't automatically make it empty. It just changes the kind of truth you're looking for. Instead of asking, did this actually happen to a stone and mortar Atlantis? You ask, does this describe something that actually happens in minds, in cultures, in my own experience? You might still care about history. You might still want to know where the stories came from, how they evolved, who wrote what. But you don't have to hitch the value of the text to sonar scans of the Atlantic seafloor. Symbolic value doesn't depend on GPS coordinates. And once you see that, another question appears at the edge of the frame. If a text might be powerful as metaphor, why do so many people double down on treating it as forbidden literal history? Who benefits from saying, this is secret knowledge they don't want you to have, instead of, this is a poetic manual for inner change? That takes us into the world of suppression narratives, censorship myths, and why the idea of a banned Atlantean gospel is so irresistible. When people talk about the emerald tablets being forbidden, there's almost always a villain waiting in the wings. Sometimes it's the church, sometimes it's the elites, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Vatican, shadowy cabals in underground bunkers. Sometimes it's a vague they who apparently spend all day making sure you don't learn about a PDF you can download in 5 seconds. The pattern is weirdly consistent. You hear lines like, this knowledge was hidden from you, or they tried to destroy these teachings, or the system doesn't want you waking up to this. The tablets are framed as contraband, like you're smuggling cosmic heroin past the guards of consensus reality. And on an emotional level, that framing works. It makes reading the text feel like an initiation. It flatters you. If they don't want you to know this, you must be part of a minority of brave truth seekers. The story turns you into a character in a drama about rebellion and awakening, instead of just someone reading an early 20th century esoteric book. But as soon as you zoom out and ask, okay, who exactly is banning this and how, the whole structure starts to wobble. Start with the obvious. The modern emerald tablets of Thoth the Atlantean are in print. They're on Amazon, they're on countless websites. You can quote them on social media. Nobody is knocking down doors over it. There is no centralized ministry of Atlantean thought deploying copyright strikes. So the claim quietly shifts. It's not literally banned, it's culturally suppressed. They don't burn it, they just ignore it, ridicule it, bury it under mainstream narratives. The suppression becomes softer, more psychological. And sometimes that does happen. Powerful institutions absolutely shape which stories feel credible and which get dismissed as fringe. But here's where we have to separate two very different things: real, documented suppression in history, and the way that idea gets repackaged for the algorithm age. Historically, censorship has teeth. Books have been burned. People have been imprisoned or killed over theology, politics, and cosmology. The Church did put texts on the Index of Forbidden Books. States did silence heresies, ban revolutionary pamphlets, shut down printing presses. But notice what actually got hammered. It wasn't usually obscure mystical manuals nobody was reading. It was texts that threatened power structures in concrete ways, challenging church authority, attacking monarchs, undermining state ideology, proposing new political orders, organizing rebellion. Hermetic and alchemical works mostly slipped through, not because they were loved, but because most officials didn't care or didn't understand them. Some got folded into respectable scholarship. Others lurked in the margins, copied by curious nobles, physicians, and occultists. Dangerous when they intersected with heresy or politics, but mostly just esoteric. Fast forward to now and the internet flips the table. We live in an environment where almost any text can be uploaded, mirrored, screenshotted, archived. Genuine bans are rare and usually noisy. If a government, a church, or a corporation tries to fully suppress something, it tends to backfire by making headlines and spawning mirror sites. So the modern suppressed knowledge pitch has to adapt. Instead of actual bonfires, it leans on vaguer forces. They don't teach you this in school. Mainstream scientists laugh at this. Historians ignore it because it doesn't fit the paradigm. Suppression becomes a mood, not a policy. And into that fog, lack of provenance slides in perfectly. When a text can't show its work, no solid chain of manuscripts, no physical artifacts, no contemporaneous references, no clear author, there are two basic ways to react. One is the historian's reaction. Until we have evidence, we treat this as a modern composition, a literary invention, or at best an unproven tradition. The other is the conspiracy-flavoured reaction. The reason we don't have evidence is because they destroyed it. Missing links become proof of hidden persecution instead of a reason to be cautious. The very gaps in the record are reframed as a sign that the text is so powerful, so dangerous. It had to be wiped from the archives, except for this one copy that conveniently survived to appear in the 1930s. You can see this move all over alternative history. Ask, where is the original? Answer, they took it. Why don't earlier authors mention this? Because they were silenced. Why does the style read like 20th century occultism? Because the translator had to disguise it. Every ordinary, boring red flag of modern authorship is alchemized into evidence of a cover-up. That doesn't mean powerful people never erase things. Libraries have burned, archives have been purged, but if you're going to claim targeted suppression of a specific text, you should expect the same standard you'd expect for any strong claim. Names, dates, mechanisms, documents. Not just vibes. So how do you navigate this without either swallowing every forbidden knowledge pitch or going full cynic? You start doing the one thing suppression stories quietly discourage. You trace things. Media literacy in this context is less about fact-checking websites and more about playing librarian. You pick up a claim and start walking backwards along the trail. You hear, these tablets were found in a hidden chamber under the Great Pyramid. Okay. Who says that first? Which edition? Which preface? Does the author give details, expedition name, year, other witnesses, photographs, any independent archaeological report? Then you see where that author got their material. Do they cite earlier texts? Are those earlier texts accessible? Can you actually read them? Do they exist in other languages? Do scholars of Egyptology, classics, or Arabic Hermetism recognize them? Or are all the references looping in a tight circle of the same 3 occult books from the last 100 years, quoting each other in a closed ecosystem? The same with dates. If a text claims to be Atlantean, but the earliest physical copy we can point to shows up in the 20th century, in English, with no older manuscript behind it, you don't need a Vatican plot to explain that. The simplest explanation is that someone in the 20th century wrote it, drawing on older motifs. That doesn't make it worthless, it just makes it modern. And once you've mapped that out, you can still choose to treat it as symbolic as we've been doing. You can still mine it for insight. You just don't have to prop up its meaning with a scaffolding of unprovable persecution. If anything, learning to follow citations and additions is a kind of real-world initiation. You move from being a passive receiver of "they don't want you to know this" narratives to an active participant in sorting signal from noise. You see that some texts truly were embattled, others simply obscure, and others brand new but dressed in antique clothing. And that shift in attention matters, because once you're less hypnotized by the supposed danger of reading a text, you can look more clearly at its actual influence. Not in hypothetical Atlantean ages, but in the modern world, how it shapes spiritual subcultures, conspiracy thinking, and even the way people imagine ancient technology. That's where we're heading next. So let's pause for a second. We've been deep in Provenance, Suppression myths, and the weird biography of a book that claims to be Atlantean scripture. Before we dive into how this text reshapes modern spirituality and conspiracy culture, it's worth resetting our compass. Because whenever you step into a landscape like this, Atlantis, forbidden tablets, ancient resets, you're actually moving through 3 different layers at once. And if you don't separate them, everything turns into mush. Layer 1 is evidence. This is the boring, necessary layer. Manuscripts, carbon dates, archaeological contexts, linguistic analysis, who quoted what, when. It's the part where you ask unromantic questions like, what's the earliest copy we can actually point to? And what physical stuff exists in the real world that ties to this story? Layer 2 is plausibility. This is where you step back and ask, given what we know about geology, history, human migration, how likely is this scenario? Could a continent-spanning Atlantean super-civilization have existed with no clear archaeological footprint? Could a set of literal Atlantean tablets survive culture after culture and suddenly emerge in polished English in the 1900s? Plausibility doesn't give you proof, but it tells you which ideas are sitting near the center of the dartboard and which ones are hanging off the wall. Layer 3 is meaning. This is where myth lives. Symbolism, personal transformation, psychological resonance. A story doesn't have to be literally true to matter. Atlantis can function as a warning about hubris, a fantasy of lost wisdom, or a metaphor for cycles of collapse and renewal, even if Plato made the whole thing up as an allegory. The trap happens when these layers get blended and nobody tells you which one you're dealing with. If someone says, Atlantis is a metaphor for inner transformation, that's a meaning claim. If they say, Atlantis was a high-tech civilization with crystal death rays and off-world portals, that's a plausibility claim that should rub up against geology and archaeology. If they say we have literal Atlantean tablets from 36,000 BCE, that's an evidence claim, and it lives or dies on manuscripts, artifacts and dates. A lot of forbidden knowledge ecosystems work by sliding between these layers mid-sentence. They'll start with poetic symbolism, drift into speculative history, then land on hard-sounding certainty. You listening feel like you've been handed proof, when what you actually got was a mood board. So here's how we're going to navigate the rest of this mystery. Whenever we talk about the Emerald Tablets and Atlantis, from here on out, we're going to mentally tag which layer we're in. When we say there's no trace of this text before the 20th century, that's evidence. When we say, if an advanced global civilization had existed 10,000 years ago, we'd expect X, Y, and Z in the record, that's plausibility. When we say this passage sounds like a map of psychological initiation more than a field report from ancient Egypt, that's meaning. You don't have to pick only one layer to care about. You can look at the same text 3 times through 3 different lenses. That's actually how you get the richest picture. The problem isn't enjoying mystery. The problem is getting locked into certainty traps. A certainty trap is when a story feels so good, so flattering, so dramatic, so neatly explanatory that you stop allowing new information to change your mind. You either become the person who swallows every Atlantis headline uncritically, or the person who auto-dismisses anything weird because serious people don't look at that. Both positions are comfortable. Neither is curious. Mystery thrives in the in-between space. You can say, I don't think this is literally an Atlantean artifact, but I'm fascinated by why so many people want it to be. Or, I'm not convinced by the geology, but I'm intrigued by how flood myths cluster in certain regions. Or even, this is almost certainly modern, but the symbolism is doing something interesting. That stance does one radical thing. It keeps you coachable. If new evidence shows up, you can move. If a claim falls apart under scrutiny, you can let it go without feeling like your whole identity was built on sand. You're not married to the narrative, you're in a relationship with the process. Echo chambers hate that. Echo chambers, whether it's hardcore skeptic forums or woo-woo Atlantis subreddits, tend to reward total loyalty. Inside them, doubt is betrayal. The Atlantis crowd might treat any request for evidence as proof you're not ready. The strict materialist crowd might treat any interest in myth or symbolism as proof you're gullible. Either way, the feedback loop flattens your thinking. So as we go forward, try this simple move. Every time you feel yourself wanting a clean, absolute answer. Atlantis definitely existed. Atlantis definitely didn't. Add the word yet. I haven't seen evidence yet. We haven't found that kind of site yet. This hasn't been demonstrated yet. It sounds small, but it cracks the door for your understanding to evolve. And if you enjoy this kind of layered approach, treating mysteries as ecosystems instead of one-shot debunks or blind belief, I've actually put together a deeper dive. I wrote a book on 12 of the most interesting unsolved cases from history and prehistory, not just Atlantis, but vanished cultures, anomalous artifacts, strange celestial events, things that sit right on that edge between what we can document and what we can only infer. For each one, we walk through the same 3 layers: what we actually know, what seems plausible given current science, and what the story might mean symbolically or psychologically. No requirement to believe, no obligation to scoff. If that sounds like your style, you can grab it on the website. There's a link down in the description. It's essentially a guided tour through a whole museum of mysteries with the same tone we're using here. Alright, back to the tablets. Because up to now, we've mostly treated them as an object. When they appeared, how they were framed, why the forbidden label doesn't really hold up. Next, we're going to watch what happens when that object hits culture like a seed hitting soil. How do the Thoth Tablets plug into 20th century occultism, New Age spirituality, and the modern conspiracy web? Why do they show up alongside talk of vibrational ascension, ancient technology, and secret brotherhoods? And then, once we've mapped that impact, we're going to circle back to the core question that pulled us in at the start. Does any of this actually support the idea that Atlantis survived some kind of global reset? We'll lay out the strongest arguments from believers, the strongest counter-arguments from skeptics, and see what's left standing when you separate evidence, plausibility, and meaning instead of letting them blur into one big glowing word, truth. That's where we're heading now. When the Thoth Tablets hit the 20th century, they didn't land in a vacuum. They dropped into a spiritual scene that was already primed for exactly this kind of thing. You had Theosophy talking about hidden masters in Tibet and secret root races. You had late 19th century occult lodges promising ancient initiations. You had science discovering invisible forces, electromagnetism, radiation, quantum weirdness, and a whole lot of people asking, if the physical world is this strange, what else is hiding under the surface? Into that mix walks a text that claims to be written by an Atlantean priest-king, teaching the laws of vibration, light, and consciousness, revealing the existence of masters who guide humanity from behind the scenes. That's catnip for New Age thought. Take the Ascended Masters idea. The Thoth Tablets talk about beings who dwell in higher planes, who step down into physical form when needed, then withdraw back into light. They guide chosen initiates, oversee cycles, guard forbidden knowledge until humanity is ready. That maps almost perfectly onto later New Age language, Saint Germain, the Great White Brotherhood, Pleiadian councils, you name it. The labels change. The basic structure doesn't. There are enlightened beings. They exist at higher frequencies. They occasionally nudge history when we're about to face-plant. Same with vibration. All through the Thoth Tablets you get language about vibrating at higher rates, about light as the fundamental reality, about dense matter being a kind of slowed-down energy. To a modern reader raised on pop science versions of quantum physics, that sounds both mystical and vaguely scientific. From there, it's a short hop to the whole New Age vocabulary of raising your vibration, shifting timelines, activating crystalline DNA. The tablets don't use those exact phrases, but the conceptual skeleton is there. Reality as layered frequencies, consciousness as a tuning mechanism, enlightenment as a shift in your vibrational address. Then there's cosmic lineage. Thoth describes himself not just as an Egyptian god figure, but as a being from a previous age, an Atlantean who survived the fall and carried his wisdom forward. That plugs straight into the idea that human history comes in grand, sweeping epochs: Lemuria, Atlantis, post-Atlantean cycles, our current dawn of Aquarius. If you've ever heard someone say, old souls are incarnating now to help humanity through the shift, you're listening to the same pattern. Souls as multi-epoch travelers, Earth as a school, catastrophes as syllabus changes, not game overs. The tablets give that narrative a scriptural feel. Not just I feel like I've had past lives, but look, here's a literal Atlantean telling you this is how it works. Now, slide one click over from spirituality into ancient tech, and the same text starts doing a different kind of work. The Thoth Tablets are full of phrases that, if you squint, sound like technology descriptions in poetic drag. Ships of flame, power drawn from the light, forces harnessed from the deep of the earth. There are references to ray-like weapons, to controlling space with sound, to manipulating the force that holds all things together. If you already believe that ancient civilizations had advanced science, you don't read those as metaphors. You read them as tech manuals with half the labels missing. That's how you get the whole ecosystem of Atlantean power crystals, pyramid energy beams, scalar waves, vortex generators. The tablets don't give blueprints, but they provide a mythic foundation. Someone long ago knew how to do this. We lost it in the reset. The elites may have fragments. A few awakened initiates might be rediscovering it. Tie that to modern discoveries, wireless electricity experiments by Tesla, unexplained precision in megalithic architecture, odd anomalies in ancient mining sites, and suddenly the tablets are doing double duty. They're not only spiritual scripture, they're cited as testimony that our ancestors weren't primitive at all. Then the internet happens, and everything accelerates. In print, the Thoth tablets used to live in a niche, obscure occult publishers, photocopied lodge materials, maybe a dog-eared paperback on the back shelf of an esoteric bookstore. Online, they break apart. You don't get the whole weird, meandering text. You get lines stripped of context and turned into quotes, as above, so below, misattributed to Thoth. The Dark Brothers lie in wait in the shadows as a screenshot over footage of politicians. Raise your vibration, and you shall become a son of the light, plastered on pastel galaxy backgrounds. The language is dense enough that you can pull almost anything out of it. Want a warning about transhumanist elites? There's a line you can use. Want encouragement that lightworkers will triumph? There's a paragraph for that. Want fuel for an ancient free energy suppressed by oil companies video? Yep, there's a sentence that can be made to fit. That's memification. The tablets stop being a bounded book with a specific origin story and become a floating aesthetic. Glowing green text. Pyramids, eyes, serpents, cosmic spirals, all tied to short, punchy lines that sound profound in isolation. On TikTok and Instagram, you'll see snippets like, "Man is in process of changing to forms that are not of this world," over glitchy montages of UFOs and CERN reactors. On conspiracy forums, passages about dark ones who feed on fear get merged with Q-style narratives about adrenochrome rings and interdimensional parasites. Almost nobody in those threads has actually sat down and read the full text carefully. They're interacting with a collage, a myth engine stripped of breaks and context. So why does this stuff stick, even when the historical footing is paper thin? Partly because it solves several psychological problems at once. First, it flatters you. If you resonate with the tablets, you're not just curious, you're an initiate. You're one of the few who remember Atlantis, who can feel the call of higher vibration. That's a powerful identity, especially if your everyday life feels small, powerless, or confusing. Second, it simplifies chaos. Global warming, financial crises, political corruption, weird tech breakthroughs. It's a lot. The Thoth-style narrative turns that into a story arc. We're in a dark age, there was a golden age, another one is coming, and shadowy forces are trying to stop the transition. You're not just doom-scrolling, you're living through Act 3 of a cosmic drama. Third, it lets you re-enchant a disenchanted world. Modern science tells you the universe is vast, mostly empty and indifferent. The Thoth tablets tell you the universe is alive with consciousness, that every atom vibrates with mind, that you personally can tune into that field. Even if you don't buy it literally, it feels better than random biochemical fluke. And finally, these ideas persist because they're modular. They can plug into almost any other belief system without blowing it up. Christian, Thoth becomes a pre-Moses mystic who knew the logos, into UFOs. Thoth is an extraterrestrial engineer, hardcore manifestation fan. The tablets are a 36,000-year-old law of attraction manual. Skeptical of institutions, the forbidden label serves as built-in armor. The very absence of evidence becomes proof of suppression. Weak evidence doesn't kill those stories, because they aren't living primarily in the evidence layer. They're rooted in meaning, identity, hope, pattern, and then retrofitted with whatever scraps of plausibility and proof the culture can find. Which brings us back to Atlantis, and the big question we started with. If the Thoth tablets have shaped so many modern narratives about ascension, hidden tech and ancient resets, how much of that actually points to a real civilization that survived a cataclysm? and how much is our own hopes and fears projected backward into myth? That's where we're going next. We'll take the specific claims people make: crystal power grids, underground cities, surviving priesthoods, and walk them through our 3 layers: what the tablets say, what the planet shows, and what the story might really be doing for us. Let's untangle this without getting hypnotized by the word Atlantis, because people usually mash 3 totally different questions into one. 1. Did a civilization like Atlantis actually exist? 2. Did it get hammered by some kind of catastrophic reset? 3. Did its knowledge survive and get carried forward by a priesthood, a bloodline, or a hidden order? Those are not the same question. You can say yes to one and no, or we don't know to the others. So let's walk through them. First, did Atlantis exist? If we're being strict and use Atlantis the way Plato does, a powerful maritime state beyond the pillars of Heracles that fought a war with a primeval Athens and sank in a single day and night, then we have to say we don't have direct evidence. No ruins on the seafloor that match his description. No inscriptions from Egypt or Mesopotamia saying, by the way, those Atlantean guys showed up again. No continuous tradition outside of Plato that clearly refers to the same place with independent detail. And when we zoom specifically into the Thoth Tablets, the problem gets sharper. The modern Thoth text is a 20th century English composition with no verifiable ancient manuscript trail. There is no Egyptian hieroglyphic version, no Greek, no Coptic, no medieval Arabic, no scribal copies you can carbon date. That means we have exactly 0 hard linkage from this specific Atlantis narrative to any actual ancient archive. Could the author have channeled real ancient memories? Could he have preserved an oral tradition that somehow skipped every papyrus and stone tablet for thousands of years? That's a belief question, not an evidence question. Historically, we can't test it. So, on did Atlantis, as described, exist, we're in the territory of possible in some broad imaginative sense, not supported by the kind of concrete cross-checked data we use for, say, Sumer or ancient Egypt. Second, was there some kind of catastrophe, a reset? Here the picture is very different. We know the planet does resets. That part is not speculative. We have the end of the last ice age with wild climate swings, mega floods from glacial lakes, sea levels rising more than 100 meters over a few thousand years. We have massive volcanic eruptions like Thera that smashed Bronze Age societies. We have asteroid and comet impacts in deeper time that sterilized whole ecosystems. Human cultures remember some of this. Flood myths, fire rains, days of darkness, ages ending and beginning again. They're everywhere. Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia, India, the Pacific, Europe, indigenous Australia. Different details, same skeleton, a world, a disaster, a remnant that survives. So, if the Thoth Tablets talk about a great cataclysm drowning an advanced coastal culture, on the catastrophe side, that's absolutely compatible with what we know the Earth does. Not Atlantis, stamped on a GPS map, but a lot of coastal settlements got obliterated as seas rose, tectonics shifted, and climate snapped from one regime to another. That's almost guaranteed. Third question. Did knowledge survive a reset? Now we're in the most interesting and most slippery zone. Because the broad answer is yes, of course knowledge survives disasters. That's what humans do after volcanoes. People rebuild villages with slightly better placement. After plagues, they develop new rituals, new medicines, new social rules about contact. After floods, they remember, don't build the temple that close to the river, and they tell that memory as a sacred story, so nobody forgets. Archaeology is full of this kind of continuity through crisis. You see pottery styles that change but don't vanish. You see tool technologies that adapt to new materials but keep the same underlying techniques. You see myths that encode real landscape changes, rivers that used to be bigger, islands that used to be hills. Migration is the delivery system. People flee a disaster zone, carrying not just objects but habits, how to farm, how to build, how to track the stars, what stories to tell around the fire about why the sky once burned. So the general Atlantis pattern: we were hit by something huge, we fled, we taught other people what we knew, is absolutely plausible at a human level. What's weak is the specific version. Atlantean priests, led by Thoth, sailed to Egypt and founded civilization as we know it, and this 20th century text is their direct testimony. We don't see an Egyptian layer of suddenly imported superscience from a lost oceanic empire. We see gradual development rooted in local Nile cultures, influenced by neighbours we can trace: Nubia, Levantine cities, Mesopotamia. We don't find temples in early Egypt that say, dedicated to the lords of Atlantis, who came from the west when their island sank. We find local gods with long evolving traditions. And we definitely don't have a chain that connects any of that to the Thoth Tablets in particular. No priestly library where a Greek scribe notes, "This emerald book of Thoth is very old. It came from the island that drowned." So, where does that leave us? On the narrow, literal claim, Atlantis as a high-tech global civilization that survived a single sudden reset and secretly seeded Egypt, with the Thoth Tablets as its preserved manual, the evidence is thin to non-existent. On the broader pattern, advanced for their time societies being devastated by real disasters, some people surviving, some knowledge continuing, memory turning into myth that's not just plausible. That's the default story of human history. We keep getting knocked down. We keep reusing pieces of what came before. We keep telling ourselves that somewhere someone remembered more. And that's where the survival narrative still matters, even if you're skeptical of every Atlantean detail. It works as a cautionary tale. Civilizations are fragile. Climate and geology don't care about our skyscrapers. And it's always been this way is a dangerous illusion. It also works as a hope story. Catastrophe doesn't mean absolute erasure. Some wisdom does make it through. A few pockets of people can carry forward enough to rebuild, sometimes better, sometimes with hard-won humility baked into their myths. The Thoth Tablets remix that deep pattern into a glamorous form. Emerald books, immortal priests, cosmic laws. Historically, the scaffolding is shaky, but the emotional core taps into something we recognize. We are the descendants of survivors. We live in a world that has ended in different ways many times before, and we're always half afraid, half convinced that somewhere out there, some older, wiser version of us already walked this path, fumbled it, and left clues. The real question may not be, did Atlantis survive the reset? But what are we doing with our own chance, knowing that resets are real and that we might be the ones some future myth calls the lost world? In the final stretch, we'll pull this together. What we can actually say, what we can't, and why a probably fictional Atlantean priest-king still has such a tight grip on the modern imagination. So let's put everything on the table clearly before we sail out of this rabbit hole. First, the names that keep getting tangled together. On one side you have the historical emerald tablet tradition, singular, a short, cryptic alchemical text in Greek and Latin tradition, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. It shows up in medieval and early modern manuscripts in Arabic commentaries, in the lab notes of European alchemists. It talks in dense symbolic language about, as above, so below, about the unity of the macrocosm and microcosm, about transmutation. It does not talk about Atlantis, Thoth as a physical Atlantean king, crystal tech, underground halls under the Sphinx, or a global reset timeline. On the other side, you have the modern Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean, plural, a sprawling English narrative that appears in the 20th century through a single modern author with no independent manuscript trail in any ancient language. It absolutely does talk about Atlantis, cataclysms, hidden halls beneath Egypt, ascended masters, and cosmic laws of vibration. Those two things are not the same animal. They overlap in vibe. Hermetic-sounding phrases talk of hidden wisdom, the figure of Thoth, Hermes, as a revealer of secrets. That's on purpose. The modern text is plugging itself into an already respected lineage. It borrows the authority of Hermeticism and the mystique of Emerald Tablet branding, then adds a layer of Atlantis, Theosophy, and early 20th century occult cosmology. Historically, what we can say with confidence looks something like this. There was a real Hermetic tradition in late antiquity. There was a real short Emerald Tablet text, transmitted in Arabic and Latin. There was a real Egyptian god Thoth, later equated with Hermes by Greeks in Egypt. There were real alchemists and mystics who treated the Emerald Tablet as a key to inner and outer transformation. We cannot say, based on any surviving evidence, that an Atlantean priest named Thoth personally authored a set of emerald slabs 36,000 years ago. Those slabs were physically stored under the Great Pyramid. The modern English Thoth Tablets are a translation of that ancient artifact. You can believe those things. You can work with the text as revelation, as channeled teaching, as inspired myth. But that's a faith position, not a historical conclusion. Now, what about the Atlantis and reset claims themselves? We've seen the range. On the strict, testable side, we know the Earth resets coastlines and climates. Sea levels rise and fall, supervolcanoes blow, impacts happen. Societies collapse, migrate, recombine. Knowledge does survive in fragments, techniques and stories. On the wilder side, a global, highly advanced, electrically powered Atlantean civilization, directing pyramids on multiple continents and leaving behind one master manual inscribed on glowing green stone. The first part is backed by geology, archaeology, and comparative myth. The second part is backed by narrative coherence and a feeling that it would be cool. So here's a way to hold it without either rolling your eyes or swallowing it whole. Think of 3 layers. Layer 1, literal history. This is where we ask, what can we date, dig up, cross-check and verify? In this layer, the Emerald Tablet tradition is late and concise. The Thoth Tablets are modern. Atlantis is a Platonic story with no independently confirmed ruins. Layer 2, mythic memory. This is where flood stories, Age of Darkness tales, and We Fled a Sinking Land legends live. Here, the Thoth Tablets are one more remix of a very old human pattern. Catastrophe, survival, transmission of wisdom. You can read them as a poetic echo of real resets, even if the details are scrambled. Layer 3. Symbolic or inner map. This is where alchemy lives when it's not about literal metals. Death and rebirth, descent into the underworld, purification, integration of opposites. In this layer, Atlantis can be a symbol of a previous state of consciousness. The reset can be an inner collapse that forces transformation. Thoth becomes the voice of your own pattern recognizing mind, guiding you through chaos. You don't have to pick a single layer and banish the others. You can just be honest about which one you're operating in at any moment. That's where a basic toolkit helps. First piece, provenance. Whenever a forbidden text appears, ask, where did it come from? Are there older copies, in multiple languages, cited by other authors? Or does it appear fully formed in the modern era, claiming ancient origins nobody noticed before? Second piece, anachronism spotting. Does the text use concepts, phrasing, or cosmology that clearly belong to the time it was written, not the time it claims to describe? Modern occult jargon, New Age ideas about vibration, space-age metaphors, nationalist politics dressed in ancient robes. These are all clues. Third piece, multiple lens reading. Take any wild claim and run it through 3 passes: literal, mythic, symbolic. Literally, does this hold up? Mythically, what pattern is it expressing? Symbolically, what psychological or spiritual process could this be talking about? If you do that, the Emerald Tablet and the Thoth Tablets both become more interesting, not less. The historical Emerald Tablet stops being just a dusty slogan and turns into a compact meditation on how change works at every scale. The modern Thoth Tablets stop being true or false and become a window into how 20th century seekers stitch together Egypt, Atlantis, theosophy, science fiction, and self-help into one grand narrative. And the mystery itself, the sense that we're living in a world with deep memory, that we walk on top of forgotten cities, that our myths might be half-remembered field reports from earlier rounds, that still matters. It matters because it reminds us that civilizations are not guaranteed. Knowledge is fragile and partial. Stories are how we carry warnings, hopes, and experiments forward when stone and paper crumble. We may never find a literal Atlantean emerald library under the Sphinx. But we are absolutely living in a moment where our choices could decide whether we become someone else's lost world story. So if you found this kind of deep dive helpful, where we love the mystery but also stress test it, take a second to like the video, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. It's always wild to see this conversation happening across so many places on the planet. And if you want to really support this kind of long-form, nuance-heavy content, the best way is actually to listen on Spotify. The link is down in the description. Let it play while you're commuting, working out, or staring up at the night sky wondering what else our species has forgotten. Whether Atlantis survived the reset or only ever lived in our collective imagination, we're the ones writing the next chapter. The tablets in front of us are digital, not emerald, but the question is the same. What knowledge are we choosing to carve into them? And what do we hope survives the next reset?